In the vast expanse of Runeterra, where magic flows through every fiber of existence, countless stories have shaped the destiny of worlds, from the primordial void that existed before creation to the modern conflicts that rage across continents. This realm has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth of legends, and the eternal struggle between light and darkness. Tonight, we journey through millennia of history, exploring the ancient forces that forged this world and the champions whose choices echo through time. Let the chronicles of Runeterra guide you into peaceful slumber as we uncover the secrets of the League of Legends universe. Before time itself held meaning, before stars painted light across the darkness, there existed only the void. This was not merely an absence of things, but a profound nothingness so complete that even the concept of existence had no place within its boundaries. In this realm of absolute emptiness dwelled the Watchers, ancient beings whose very nature defied comprehension. They possessed eyes that had never seen, ears that had never heard, and forms that had never known the sensation of touch. For eons beyond counting, they drifted through their domain of nothingness, unaware that they themselves were alive. Content in their eternal slumber of non-existence, the Watchers had achieved a perfect peace through their ignorance of being. They knew neither pleasure nor pain, neither hope nor despair, for these concepts required awareness of self, and self required the contrast that only existence could provide. Their realm was one of absolute stillness, where even the notion of time held no meaning, for without change, without the possibility of something different, there could be no passage from one moment to the next. Then, deep within the infinite expanse of this primordial void, something unprecedented occurred. A single point of light appeared, brilliant and warm, cutting through the darkness like a beacon of possibility. In that instant, everything changed. The light brought with it the terrible gift of awareness, and for the first time in their eternal existence, the Watchers understood that they were alive. This revelation filled them with a rage so profound it would echo through all of creation, for they had lost something precious beyond measure: their perfect ignorance, their blissful non-being. As the Watchers approached this intrusive light, driven by fury and curiosity in equal measure, they discovered that it was more than mere illumination. It was a window, a peephole into an entirely different kind of reality that expanded with each passing moment, pushing further into their domain of nothingness. Through this cosmic aperture, they witnessed the birth of something they could not comprehend, a realm where existence was not only possible, but inevitable. The first beings to emerge into this new reality were the Celestials, entities of such immense power and cosmic significance that they shaped the very foundations of what would become known as existence itself. Some of these primordial beings were formless, pure consciousness and energy that required physical vessels to interact with the material realm. Among these was the entity that would later be known as Bard, the wandering caretaker, whose essence became bound to objects that could contain and channel its otherworldly nature. Other celestials took forms that defied mortal understanding, vast and magnificent creatures whose very presence warped reality around them. The greatest among these was Aurelian Sol, the Star Forger, a cosmic dragon of incomprehensible size and power, whose purpose was to bring light and warmth to the cold emptiness of space. With each beat of his mighty wings, with each breath from his celestial lungs, Aurelian Sol spread radiance across the void, leaving traces of his cosmic essence wherever he traveled. These traces of starlight merged with the cosmic dust that drifted through the newborn universe, and from this union came the birth of planets and stars. Each world that formed carried within it a fragment of Aurelian Sol's power, a spark of creation that would determine its destiny. Most of these newly formed worlds remained barren and lifeless, spinning endlessly through the void as monuments to the cosmic forces that had brought them into being. However, occasionally, under the precise conditions required by the mysterious forces of creation, life would take hold on these distant worlds. On one such planet, orbiting a star that was itself a manifestation of Aurelian Sol's cosmic journey, an unprecedented gathering of celestials would occur. These powerful beings, recognizing the unique potential of this particular world, came together to perform an act of creation that would surpass even their individual capabilities. Working in concert, the Celestials gathered world runes, artifacts of such immense magical power that they contained the fundamental forces of creation itself. With these tools of cosmic significance, they began the careful process of shaping what would become known as Runeterra, a world destined to become the stage for countless stories of heroism, tragedy, and transformation. The planet's position in the universe was no accident, for it orbited one of Aurelian Sol's own stars, ensuring that it would be bathed in the cosmic dragon's radiance for all eternity. As Runeterra took shape under the guidance of the Celestials, the fundamental forces that would govern its existence began to establish themselves. The first stirrings of life emerged not as complex organisms, but as pure manifestations of concept and emotion, beings that existed at the intersection of the physical and spiritual realms. These primordial spirits represented the most basic aspects of existence, from the nurturing force of growth to the inevitable certainty of decay. Among the first and most powerful of these entities was Nagakaburos, an ancient force that claimed dominion over the very concept of life itself. This entity embodied the principle of constant motion and change, the idea that life must always move forward, always grow, always transform. Standing in opposition to this force of endless vitality was the entity known only as the Grim, a manifestation of death's inevitability and the peace that comes with final rest. In the darker corners of this emerging reality, beings of a different nature began to take form. These were the first demons, entities born from the negative emotions and fears that would eventually plague sentient life. 10 of these creatures, known as the 10 Kings, established themselves as the primary forces of malevolence in the world. Among them were beings whose names would later become synonymous with terror: Fiddlesticks, the first of 10, who embodied the primal fear that lurks in every conscious mind, and beings whose very presence warped reality around them. As the spiritual foundations of Runeterra solidified, a new type of being began to emerge from the intersection of the physical and magical realms. These were the Yordles, small humanoid creatures with an innate connection to magic that far exceeded their diminutive size. The earliest Yordles, beings like the ancient Nar and the oceanic Fizz, found themselves drawn to a particular location where the barriers between the physical world and the spirit realm were at their thinnest. Here, around a massive tree that seemed to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions, the Yordles founded their first great settlement. Bandle City grew organically around this bandle tree, its structures and pathways shaped by Yordle magic and whimsy in equal measure. From this central location, the industrious Yordles began creating small gateways that would allow them to travel between their magical realm and the physical world, establishing a network of connections that would persist for millennia to come. During these primordial ages, the continents and islands of Runeterra slowly began to take their recognizable shapes. Land masses shifted and settled as geological forces, guided by both natural processes and magical influences, carved out the geography that would define the world's future. In the eastern reaches of the world, a group of islands formed that would later be known as the Blessed Isles, destined to become a place of incredible natural beauty and magical significance. It was here that one of the greatest spirits of the natural world, Maokai, would eventually discover the spring of life, a source of such pure and powerful magic that it could nurture entire ecosystems. Using this mystical water, Maokai transformed the Blessed Isles into a verdant paradise, creating vast forests filled with saplings and nature spirits that lived in perfect harmony with their environment. The islands became a sanctuary where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds were so thin that they might as well not have existed at all. Meanwhile, in the vast oceanic expanses that covered much of Runeterra's surface, other civilizations were beginning to take shape. In the waters that would later be known as the Guardian Sea, the young Yordle Fizz found himself among the earliest ocean-dwelling peoples, learning their ways and contributing his own magical abilities to their growing society. These aquatic civilizations thrived for centuries, developing technologies and magics perfectly suited to their underwater environment. However, their prosperity was not destined to last. A catastrophic invasion by the warlike Gallons brought devastation to these peaceful ocean dwellers, destroying their cities and scattering their people across the seas. The trauma of witnessing such wholesale destruction proved overwhelming for the sensitive Fizz, whose connection to the magical forces of the ocean made him acutely aware of every life lost, every dream shattered. Unable to cope with the magnitude of the tragedy, Fizz retreated into a magical hibernation that would last for over a millennium, his consciousness withdrawn from a world that had proven too cruel for his gentle nature. In the far northern reaches of Runeterra, where the cold winds howled across landscapes of ice and stone. A different kind of power was awakening here, in the region that would eventually be known as the Freljord. Divine beings of immense power were coming into existence. These were the Volai, the icy demigods who would shape the harsh northern lands according to their will and nature. Among the first and most influential of these beings were Volibear, the relentless storm, whose very presence brought the fury of lightning and thunder. Anivia, the cryo-phoenix, whose wisdom was matched only by her connection to the eternal cycles of death and rebirth. And Orn, the fire below the mountain, whose forge work would create artifacts of legendary power. Alongside these major powers, other divine entities took their places in the pantheon of the North, including the twin Seal Sisters, whose domain encompassed the frozen seas and the creatures that dwelled within them. These demigods immediately set about the work of terraforming their domain, using their incredible powers to reshape the landscape according to their vision. Mountains rose at their command. Rivers carved new channels through the ice, and the very climate of the region bent to their collective will. The land they created was harsh and unforgiving, but it was also magnificent in its stark beauty, a realm where only the strongest could survive and thrive as the divine powers worked to establish their domain. The first mortal races began to appear across Runeterra. Humans, trolls, minotaurs, and yetis all emerged during this primordial age, each species adapting to the environments in which they found themselves. These early peoples quickly learned that survival required not just physical strength and cunning, but also the ability to understand and work with the magical forces that permeated their world. In the northern lands, human tribes gathered around the demigods they encountered, offering worship and service in exchange for protection and guidance. These early relationships between mortals and divinity would establish patterns of faith and devotion that would persist throughout Runeterra's history, creating the foundation for countless religious traditions and spiritual practices. Far to the east, on the continent of Ionia, a different approach to the relationship between mortals and magic was developing. Here, humans learned to live in harmony with the natural world and the spirit realm that overlaid it, developing a philosophy that emphasized balance, understanding, and mutual respect. Rather than seeking to dominate or control the magical forces around them, the Ionians sought to become partners with these powers, creating a symbiotic relationship that benefited all involved. In the ancient land of Camivore, yet another approach emerged, as humans formed great kingdoms, built on principles of honor, nobility, and martial prowess. These early realms established traditions of chivalry and governance that would influence civilizations across the world, creating models for how mortals might organize themselves into stable, prosperous societies. However, not all of the early relationships between mortals and the powers of their world were peaceful. In many regions, conflicts arose between different groups seeking to claim the same resources or territory. Among the most significant of these early conflicts was the war between the first human civilizations and a race of beings known as the Sky Titans, colossal entities whose power threatened to overwhelm the fragile mortal settlements that had begun to dot Runeterra's landscape. The Sky Titans were beings of immense size and power, capable of reshaping landscapes with their movements and commanding natural forces that dwarfed mortal comprehension. Their very existence posed a threat to the developing human civilizations, for their needs and desires were so vast that they could inadvertently destroy entire communities simply by pursuing their own goals. Faced with this overwhelming threat, the enlightened mortals of Ionia turned to the spirit realm for aid. Through careful study and spiritual discipline, they learned to channel the magical energies that flowed through their world, transforming themselves into beings of greater power and capability. These transformed humans became the first Vastayashai, mortals who had successfully merged their essential nature with the magical forces of the spirit realm. With their newfound abilities, the Vastayashai proved more than capable of standing against the Sky Titans. The war that followed was epic in scope, ranging across multiple continents and involving powers that reshaped the very landscape of Runeterra. Ultimately, through courage, sacrifice, and the wise application of their spiritual gifts, the Vastayashai and their human allies succeeded in defeating the Titans, ensuring that mortal civilization would have the opportunity to flourish and grow. In the aftermath of this great victory, the Vastayashai found themselves forever changed by their experiences, having touched the power of the spirit realm so deeply. They could never again be purely human, nor could they return entirely to the spiritual plane they had drawn upon. Instead, they became something new, beings that existed comfortably in both worlds while belonging entirely to neither. As time passed, these transformed beings began to form relationships with the unchanged humans around them, and from these unions came a new race, the Vastaya. These offspring inherited aspects of both their human and Vastayashai heritage, possessing an innate connection to magic, while retaining the adaptability and determination that characterized humanity. The early Vastaya quickly proved themselves to be remarkable beings, capable of incredible feats and possessed of wisdom that belied their relatively recent origins. The Vastaya communities soon began to spread across Runeterra, with different groups adapting to various environments and developing unique cultures suited to their chosen homes. Some, like the Kilash, made their way to the deserts of Shurima, where they learned to thrive in the harsh, sun-baked landscape. Others, such as the Morai, were drawn to the coastal waters west of Mount Targon, where they developed an aquatic civilization that rivaled anything the ancient ocean peoples had achieved. Thus, in these earliest stages of Runeterra's existence, the fundamental patterns that would shape the world's future were established. The interaction between mortals and magic, the relationship between the physical and spiritual realms, and the endless cycle of conflict and cooperation that would define the world's history all found their roots in these primordial times. The stage was set for the great dramas that would follow, as gods and mortals, spirits and demons, all prepared to play their parts in the unfolding story of creation itself. In the harsh northern reaches of Runeterra, where the winds carried both the promise of life and the threat of death, a new chapter in the world's history began to unfold. The Freljord, as this frozen realm would come to be known, witnessed the rise of beings whose power rivaled that of the Celestials themselves. These were the demigods, entities born from the fundamental forces of nature and given consciousness, will, and purpose. Their emergence marked the beginning of an age when the line between the mortal and divine would blur, when the very landscape would bend to the whims of beings whose emotions could reshape mountains and whose conflicts could alter the course of rivers. The first and perhaps most influential of these divine beings was Volibear, the relentless storm. His form was that of a colossal bear wreathed in lightning, his very presence announcing itself through thunder that rolled across the frozen peaks and valleys. Volibear embodied the raw, untamed fury of nature itself, the principle that strength and savagery were not merely tools for survival, but sacred truths that defined the natural order. When Volibear walked the earth, the ground trembled beneath his massive paws, and the aurora borealis danced overhead in response to his mood. Opposing Volibear's philosophy of perpetual conflict stood Anivia, the cryophoenix, whose wisdom had been earned through countless cycles of death and rebirth. Where Volibear saw strength in destruction, Anivia understood the necessity of both creation and destruction, the eternal cycle that allowed life to renew itself even in the harshest conditions. Her form was that of a magnificent bird composed of living ice and snow, her wings spanning distances that could shadow entire valleys. When she flew overhead, the very air crystallized in her wake, creating patterns of frost so beautiful they could bring mortals to tears. Between these two extremes stood Orn, the fire below the mountain, whose domain was not the battlefield or the sky, but the forge. Orn represented the principle of creation through craft, the idea that true strength came not from destroying one's enemies, but from building something better, something that could endure long after its creator had passed into legend. His workshop lay deep within the mountains, where the heat of his forge competed with the eternal cold of the Freljord, creating conditions where the most extraordinary artifacts could be born. Among these three primary powers, other divine entities established their own domains. The Seal Sisters, twin goddesses whose names have been lost to time, claimed dominion over the frozen seas that surrounded the Freljord's coastlines. Their power ensured that the ocean would never completely freeze, maintaining the delicate balance that allowed life to persist even in the depths of winter. When they sang together, their voices could be heard across vast distances, calling to the seals and whales that served as their messengers and companions. As these demigods established their territories and began to shape the world according to their visions, they encountered the first mortal beings to inhabit their domain. Humans, drawn by the promise of shelter and protection, began to gather in small tribes around the sites where the demigods made their presence known. These early peoples faced challenges that would have overwhelmed their cousins in warmer climates. For the Freljord demanded not just physical endurance, but spiritual strength as well. The relationship between the demigods and their mortal followers was complex and often fraught with tension. The divine beings possessed power beyond mortal comprehension. Yet they were not distant, abstract forces like the Celestials. They walked among their followers, spoke with them directly, and involved themselves intimately in mortal affairs. This proximity created opportunities for profound connection, but also for devastating conflict, as the emotions and desires of beings capable of reshaping reality could have catastrophic consequences for those around them. In time, 3 mortal women would emerge who would challenge the very foundations of this divine order. These were the 3 sisters, Avarosa, Serilda, and Lysandra, each possessing not only exceptional strength and intelligence, but also an unprecedented ambition to master the magical forces that shaped their world. Unlike their contemporaries, who sought to appease or serve the demigods, the sisters believed that mortals could and should claim divine power for themselves. Avarosa, the eldest, was drawn to the mysteries that lay beneath the frozen surface of the world. She believed that somewhere in the depths of the earth, buried beneath layers of ice and stone, lay secrets that could grant mortals the power to control their own destinies. Her expeditions into the deepest caverns and most dangerous crevasses brought her into contact with forces that existed at the very foundation of reality, powers so ancient and fundamental that even touching them left permanent marks upon her soul. The price of Avarosa's ambition became apparent when she attempted to master the twisting dark that dwelled beneath the world, a force that existed in opposition to the light that had first awakened the Watchers. The dark was not evil in any conventional sense, but it was alien to mortal understanding, requiring a form of consciousness that humans were never meant to possess. When Avarosa opened herself to this power, it deafened her, not merely to sound, but to entire categories of sensory experience, leaving her forever changed by her encounter with the incomprehensible. Serilda, the middle sister, turned her attention skyward, believing that the heavens held the key to transcending mortal limitations. She studied the movements of the stars and the patterns of the aurora, seeking to understand the celestial forces that governed the world from above. Her research led her to attempt communication with powers that dwelled beyond the physical realm, entities whose very existence challenged the boundaries between thought and reality. When Serilda tried to command the forces of the first twilight, the liminal space between day and night, where cosmic energies were most accessible to mortal perception, she discovered that some powers were never meant to be wielded by those bound to the material world. The attempt cost her voice, not merely the ability to speak, but the capacity to express her thoughts and emotions through any conventional means. Yet even this sacrifice did not grant her the mastery she sought, leaving her forever frustrated by powers that remained just beyond her reach. Lysandra, the youngest of the 3 sisters, proved to be the most dangerous, precisely because she was the most pragmatic. Where her sisters had sought to master forces beyond mortal comprehension through direct confrontation, Lysandra understood that true power often came through negotiation, alliance, and careful manipulation. Her ambition was no less than theirs. But her methods were far more calculated and ultimately far more successful. While Avarosa delved into the depths and Cyrilda reached for the heavens, Lysandra turned her attention to the spaces between worlds, the liminal realms where reality grew thin and other forms of consciousness might be contacted. Through the ancient art of dreamwalking, she learned to project her consciousness beyond the boundaries of the physical world, exploring realms that existed parallel to, but separate from, the reality she knew. It was during one of these dream journeys that Lysandra encountered the Watchers, those ancient entities that had dwelled in the void since before creation began. The meeting was not accidental, for the Watchers had been watching Runeterra since the first light had awakened them from their eternal slumber. They had observed the rise of the Celestials, the shaping of the world, and the emergence of life with growing interest and mounting rage. In Lysandra, the Watchers found something they had not expected: a mortal consciousness capable of comprehending their nature and desires. Unlike the other inhabitants of Runeterra, who were so thoroughly bound to the concept of existence that they could not imagine its absence, Lysandra possessed the intellectual flexibility to understand what the Watchers offered. They spoke to her of a return to the perfect peace that had existed before creation, a time when suffering was impossible because consciousness itself did not exist. The bargain they proposed was elegantly simple. In exchange for power beyond imagining and virtual immortality for herself and her followers, Lysandra would serve as their agent in the physical world, preparing Runeterra for their eventual arrival. When the time was right, the Watchers would cross over from the void and unmake creation itself, returning the universe to the perfect nothingness it had once enjoyed. To most mortals, such a proposition would have been horrifying, but Lysandra's experiences with power had taught her that existence was often more suffering than joy, more struggle than peace. The promise of an end to all conflict, all pain, all uncertainty held an appeal that she found difficult to resist. Moreover, the immediate benefits of the alliance were undeniable. The Watchers granted her abilities that far exceeded anything her sisters had achieved, powers that made her virtually unstoppable in pursuit of her goals. With her newfound abilities, Lysandra returned to the physical world and began to consolidate power throughout the Freljord. Her sisters, still struggling with the consequences of their own failed attempts at transcendence, found themselves no match for Lysandra's Watcher-enhanced capabilities. Soon, all three sisters were working together under Lysandra's leadership, though only she knew the true source of their power and the ultimate purpose toward which they worked. The transformation of the three sisters and their followers into something approaching demigods themselves did not go unnoticed by the actual demigods who ruled the Freljord. Volibear, in particular, viewed their rise with suspicion and growing hostility. The relentless storm had little patience for mortals who sought to transcend their natural limitations. viewing such ambition as an affront to the natural order he represented. The conflict that developed between the sisters and the demigods was inevitable, but its form and consequences surprised everyone involved. Rather than engaging in direct confrontation, which would have favored the established divine powers, Lysandra chose to exploit the existing tensions between the demigods themselves. Volibear and Ornn had long held different philosophies about how their domain should be governed, with Volibear favoring constant conflict and struggle, while Ornn preferred peaceful creation and craftsmanship. Lysandra's machinations turned this philosophical difference into open warfare. She convinced Volibear that Ornn's followers posed a threat to the natural order, while simultaneously persuading some of Ornn's people that Volibear's aggression needed to be checked before it destroyed everything they had built. The resulting conflict between the two demigod brothers was exactly what Lysandra had hoped for, weakening both sides while allowing her own power to grow. The war between Volibear and Ornn was unlike anything the Freljord had ever witnessed. Mountains cracked under the force of their battles. Glaciers shifted and reformed, and the very climate of the region fluctuated wildly as the two divine beings unleashed their full power against each other. Volibear's lightning scarred the landscape, while Ornn's forged fire melted ancient ice and reshaped the terrain according to his will. The turning point came when Volibear, driven to desperation by his inability to decisively defeat his brother, made a choice that would echo through the ages. He demanded that Ornn create weapons and armor for him, tools that would give him the edge he needed to end their conflict once and for all. When Ornn refused, citing the sacred traditions that governed his craft and his unwillingness to create instruments of destruction, Volibear's rage consumed all reason. In a moment of unprecedented fury, Volibear attacked Ornn directly, overwhelming his brother through sheer savagery and taking by force what had been denied to him through negotiation. The relentless storm claimed Ornn's rune-inscribed armor and weapons, adding their power to his own while systematically destroying all of Ornn's followers who had witnessed this act of fraternal betrayal. With Ornn's defeat, only one major demigod remained to oppose Lysandra's growing influence over the Freljord. The youngest of the three sisters turned her attention to Anivia, but the Cryo-Phoenix proved far more difficult to manipulate than the male demigods had been. Anivia's wisdom, earned through countless cycles of death and rebirth, allowed her to see through Lysandra's deceptions and recognize the true nature of the power she wielded. Rather than engaging in the kind of direct confrontation that had destroyed the relationship between Volibear and Ornn, Anivia attempted to reason with Lysandra, trying to make her understand the true consequences of her alliance with the Watchers. The Cryo-Phoenix explained that the Void's promise of perfect peace was, in fact, perfect death, not just for individuals, but for the very concept of existence itself. Lysandra, however, had traveled too far down her chosen path to turn back. The power she had gained from the Watchers had become an integral part of her being, and she had made promises that could not be broken without destroying herself in the process. When Anivia's arguments failed to sway her, the Cryo-Phoenix made a difficult decision. Rather than allow the Watcher's corruption to spread further, she would have to stop Lysandra by force. The battle between Lysandra and Anivia was fought on multiple levels simultaneously. In the physical realm, ice and snow clashed against the otherworldly energies that Lysandra commanded. In the spiritual realm, Anivia's ancient wisdom contended with the alien intelligence of the Watchers themselves. The conflict raged across the Freljord for months, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Ultimately, it was not superior power, but superior strategy that determined the outcome. Lysandra realized that she could not defeat Anivia through direct confrontation, but she could force the Cryo-Phoenix into a position where victory would be impossible. Using her knowledge of the ancient places of power scattered throughout the Freljord, Lysandra maneuvered the battle toward the Howling Abyss, a chasm so deep and treacherous that even demigods approached it with caution. At the edge of this primordial wound in the earth, Lysandra revealed the true extent of her preparation. The sisters' followers, enhanced by Watcher power and utterly devoted to their cause, had been positioned throughout the region. When Lysandra gave the signal, they began a ritual that would thin the barriers between the Void and Runeterra, allowing the Watchers themselves to begin manifesting in the physical world. Anivia watched in horror as creatures of pure nothingness began to emerge from cracks in reality itself. These Voidborn were not like the demons or spirits that inhabited Runeterra, for they carried within them the fundamental principle of uncreation. Wherever they walked, the very concept of existence began to fray, leaving behind not destruction, but absolute absence. Faced with this unprecedented threat, Anivia made a choice that demonstrated both her wisdom and her sacrifice. Rather than continuing her battle with Lysandra, she turned her full power against the emerging Voidborn, using her control over ice and cold to create barriers that would slow their advance and buy time for a more permanent solution. The sight of the Void creatures and the devastation they brought finally broke through Lysandra's certainty about her chosen path. For the first time since making her bargain with the Watchers, she began to understand the true magnitude of what she had set in motion. The perfect peace the Watchers promised was not the end of suffering, but the end of everything, including all the beauty and joy that existence could offer alongside its pain. Realizing that she had doomed not just the Freljord, potentially all of Runeterra, Lysandra made a desperate decision. Using the power the Watchers had granted her, she began to turn that power against its source. The process was excruciating, for she was essentially using her own essence as a weapon against beings who had become part of her fundamental nature. The final phase of the battle saw Lysandra, Anivia, and even the defeated Ornn working together against the emerging threat. Ornn, despite his injuries and his anger at Volibear's betrayal, could not stand by while the very concept of creation was under attack. From his forge, he created weapons and tools specifically designed to combat void creatures. Items that could harm beings that existed in opposition to existence itself. The climax came when Lysandra realized that the only way to stop the Watcher's emergence was to sacrifice everything she had gained from her bargain with them, drawing upon the magical energies of her sisters and followers. She performed a ritual of unprecedented scope and power, rather than trying to destroy the Watchers, which was likely impossible. She chose to imprison them in a state between existence and non-existence, trapping them in ice that was colder than the void itself. The process required the sacrifice of Avarosa and Cyrilda, whose life forces were needed to power the ritual that would create what came to be known as true ice. This magical substance was more than mere frozen water. It was crystallized possibility. Matter that existed in a state of perfect potential without ever actualizing into any specific form. As her sisters died to fuel the ritual, Lysandra used the last of her strength to entomb the Watchers and the most powerful Voidborn in true ice, creating a prison that would hold them suspended between worlds. The ancient Yordle Nar, who had been caught up in the magical backlash of the battle, was also trapped in this crystalline stasis. Though, unlike the Watchers, he remained fundamentally unchanged by the experience. The effort of creating this prison and maintaining it drained almost all of Lysandra's power, leaving her a shadow of her former self, but still bound to her eternal vigil. She established the Frost Guard, a secret organization dedicated to ensuring that the Watchers never escaped their icy prison, and began the long task of watching over the greatest threat Runeterra had ever faced, the war between the sisters and the demigods, and the subsequent battle against the Void, had lasting consequences that extended far beyond the Freljord. The conflict had proven that mortal ambition, when coupled with sufficient power, could challenge even divine authority. It had also demonstrated that some forces were too dangerous for any being to control, no matter how wise or powerful they might be. In the aftermath of these events, the surviving inhabitants of the Freljord began to pick up the pieces of their shattered world. The climate had been permanently altered by the magical energies unleashed during the conflict, becoming even harsher and more unforgiving than before. The demigods, those who survived, retreated from direct involvement in mortal affairs, having learned that their power alone was not sufficient to protect their domain from all threats. Volibear, bearing the weight of his betrayal of Ornn and the knowledge that his actions had contributed to the crisis, became more reclusive and bitter. His philosophy of eternal conflict took on a darker tone, reflecting his understanding that some battles could never truly be won, only endured. Anivia, wise and patient as ever, took on the role of guardian and guide, helping the survivors rebuild while remaining vigilant for signs that the ancient threat might be stirring once again. The story of the three sisters became legend throughout the Freljord, though the true details of their bargain with the Watchers and the sacrifices required to stop them were known only to a few. Most people understood only that great powers had clashed, that heroes had made terrible sacrifices, and that the price of ambition could be higher than anyone imagined. Far from the frozen north, other civilizations continued their own development, unaware of how close they had come to absolute annihilation. In Ionia, The philosophy of balance between mortal and magical forces gained new adherents as subtle echoes of the Freljordian conflict reached the eastern lands. The Ionians instinctively understood that harmony was preferable to domination, though they could not have articulated why this truth seemed so urgent. The events in the Freljord also influenced the development of what would later become Demacia, the scattered peoples who would eventually unite under that banner, carried with them stories of the dangers inherent in uncontrolled magic, tales that would eventually evolve into the philosophical foundations of Demacian society. The idea that magic was powerful but potentially catastrophic would become central to their worldview, shaping their approach to magical phenomena for millennia to come. Thus, the age of demigods and early civilizations drew to a close with lessons learned in blood and sacrifice. The relationship between mortals and the divine had been forever altered. The dangers of unchecked ambition had been demonstrated, and the foundations had been laid for the great civilizations that would follow. The world had survived its first truly existential threat, but the cost had been enormous, and the scars left by this ancient conflict would influence the course of history for thousands of years to come. In the vast southern continent that would come to be known as Shurima, a civilization of unprecedented scope and grandeur was taking shape beneath the blazing desert Sunday. Here, where the sands stretched endlessly toward horizons that shimmered with heat, the descendants of ancient peoples had learned to harness powers that rivaled those of the demigods themselves. The empire they built would stand as testament to mortal achievement, a golden age of prosperity and wonder that would cast its shadow across the known world for millennia. The foundation of Shuriman greatness lay in their discovery of ascension, a ritual of transformation that could elevate exceptional mortals to a state approaching divinity. This process, guided by the wisdom of the aspects of Targon and powered by the cosmic energies channeled through massive sun disks, created beings of immense power and near immortality. The Ascended, as they came to be known, served as both protectors and rulers of the empire, their superhuman abilities ensuring that Shurima could expand and prosper even in the harshest environments. The ritual of ascension was not undertaken lightly, for it required not only exceptional virtue and capability, but also the precise alignment of cosmic forces that occurred only rarely. Candidates for ascension underwent years of preparation, proving themselves through acts of heroism, wisdom, and selfless devotion to the empire. When the moment finally came, they would stand before the sun disk as its concentrated stellar energy washed over them, either transforming them into beings of divine power or destroying them utterly if they proved unworthy. Among the first and greatest of the Ascended was Setica, a warrior queen whose prowess in battle was matched only by her strategic brilliance. She wielded a weapon of incredible power known as the Chalakar, a disc-shaped blade that could harness energies from beyond Mount Targon itself. When Setica raised the Chalakar toward the sun, its surface would blaze with celestial fire, and she could channel this power to perform feats that seemed impossible even by the standards of the Ascended. Under Sataka's leadership, Shurima began its great expansion, spreading its influence across the continent through a combination of military conquest, cultural assimilation, and the promise of prosperity under imperial rule. The empire's engineers constructed vast networks of roads, aqueducts, and magical infrastructure that brought the blessings of civilization to previously barren lands. Oasis settlements grew into thriving cities, and nomadic tribes found new purpose as citizens of a growing realm. As Shurima expanded, it encountered and absorbed many smaller nations and city-states. The integration of these diverse peoples brought new knowledge, skills, and magical traditions into the empire, creating a synthesis of cultures that enriched Shuriman's society while spreading its influence ever further. The empire's approach to conquest was typically generous, offering conquered peoples the opportunity to maintain their customs and traditions while accepting Shuriman rule and contributing to the greater glory of the empire. Two of the most significant acquisitions during this period were the ancient kingdoms of Icathia and Ashra-Vazaun. Icathia, with its sophisticated understanding of elemental magic and its impressive architectural achievements, brought valuable knowledge about the manipulation of natural forces. The Icathians had developed techniques for working with living stone and controlling the very foundations of the earth, skills that proved invaluable in Shurima's ongoing construction projects. Ashra-Vazan, located in a strategic position along important trade routes, contributed its expertise in engineering and commerce. The city's inhabitants had long been masters of mechanical innovation and maritime technology, and their integration into the empire significantly enhanced Shurima's ability to project power across vast distances. The combination of Icathian magic and Ashran engineering would prove crucial in the empire's later achievements and, tragically, in its eventual downfall. The heart of the empire remained its capital, a magnificent city built around the great sun disk that served as both the source of ascension and the center of Shuriman power. The construction of this metropolis was a project that spanned generations, involving the collaboration of the finest architects, engineers, and mages from across the known world. The city's pyramids and temples rose like golden mountains from the desert floor, their surfaces inscribed with hieroglyphs that told the story of the empire's glory and the deeds of its heroes. At the center of it all stood the sun disk itself, a marvel of ancient technology that captured and concentrated stellar energy on a scale that defied comprehension. The disk was more than merely a tool for creating ascended warriors. It was a symbol of Shurima's mastery over the fundamental forces of creation. When it blazed to life during ascension ceremonies, its radiance could be seen from hundreds of miles away, a beacon that proclaimed the empire's power to all who dwelt beneath the desert sky. The governance of this vast empire required wisdom and skill to match its military might. The Ascended served not only as protectors, but as administrators, judges, and spiritual guides for their mortal subjects. Each Ascended ruler brought their own perspective and abilities to their role, creating a diverse but unified leadership that could address the complex challenges of governing such an extensive and varied realm. Among the most beloved of these leaders were the brothers Nasus and Renekton, whose complementary abilities made them an formidable team. Nasus, the curator of the sands, possessed an intellect that seemed to encompass all knowledge, and his strategic mind could perceive patterns and possibilities that escaped lesser beings. His brother Renekton, the butcher of the sands, embodied the martial prowess of the Empire, his strength in battle legendary, even among the Ascended. The partnership between the brothers exemplified the best aspects of Shuriman leadership. Where Nasus provided careful planning and deep wisdom, Renekton offered decisive action and unwavering courage. Together, they expanded the Empire's borders while ensuring that its internal stability remained unshaken. Their loyalty to each other and to Shurima became a model for the relationships between all Ascended, demonstrating that even beings of divine power could work together for the greater good. One of Renekton's greatest triumphs came during the defense of Zureta, an important border city that found itself under siege by a massive invading force. The attackers had come in such numbers that the city's defenders, despite their courage and skill, were overwhelmed and on the verge of collapse. When word of the crisis reached the capital, Renekton immediately set out for Zureta, racing across the desert with superhuman speed. He arrived to find the city's walls breached and enemy forces pouring through the gaps like a flood of destruction. Without hesitation, Renekton plunged into the battle, his massive blade carving through the invaders with terrible efficiency. For 3 days and nights, he fought without rest, holding the breach single-handedly, while the city's defenders regrouped and reinforced their positions. His presence on the battlefield was like a force of nature, inspiring the defenders while striking terror into the hearts of their enemies. When Nasus finally arrived with reinforcements, he found his brother still fighting at the breach, surrounded by the bodies of hundreds of fallen enemies, but still standing strong. The sight of the two brothers reunited on the battlefield broke the spirit of the remaining invaders, who fled rather than face the combined might of 2 Ascended warriors. Zureta was saved, and Renekton's heroism earned him the title of Gatekeeper of Shurima, a position that recognized his role as the Empire's primary defender against external threats. As Shurima's power grew, so did the envy and fear of its neighbors. The Empire's success had been built not only on military conquest, but on the prosperity it brought to its subjects. And this prosperity created resentment among those who remained outside its borders. Independent kingdoms and city-states found themselves increasingly isolated as trade routes shifted to favor Shuriman cities, and their own people began to look enviously at the wealth and stability enjoyed by the Empire's citizens. The kingdom of Icathia, despite having been absorbed into the Empire, harbored particular resentment toward Shuriman rule. The Icathian nobility had never fully accepted their reduced status within the imperial hierarchy, and they chafed under the authority of Ascended rulers, whom they viewed as foreign usurpers. Their discontent was carefully hidden, but it grew stronger with each passing year, fed by the pride of a people who remembered their independence and the glory of their ancient kingdom. The Icathian Council, which had been allowed to maintain a degree of autonomy within the empire, began to meet in secret to discuss ways of regaining their freedom. Their conversations inevitably turned to the source of Shuriman power, the Ascended themselves. These god warriors seemed invincible in conventional battle, but the Icathians were not content to accept conventional limitations. They began to search for weapons and allies that could match or exceed the power of ascension. Their search led them to explore magical traditions that previous generations had considered too dangerous to pursue. Deep beneath Icathia lay caverns and ruins that predated even the oldest Shuriman monuments. Places where ancient powers slumbered in darkness. The Icathian mages who ventured into these depths discovered artifacts and energies that seemed to offer the power they sought, though the true nature and origin of these forces remained mysterious. The breakthrough came when an earthquake opened a previously unknown chamber deep beneath the city of Sabera. Within this chamber, Icathian explorers found what appeared to be a crack in reality itself, a wound in the fabric of existence through which alien energies seeped like poison from an infected wound. The Void Rift, as it came to be known, emanated a power that was fundamentally different from any magic the Icathians had previously encountered. Unlike the solar energies that powered Shuriman Ascension, or the elemental forces that Icathian mages traditionally manipulated, the void energy was characterized by its opposition to existence itself. Where normal magic sought to transform or enhance reality, void magic sought to unmake it, to return everything it touched to the primordial nothingness that had existed before creation. This destructive potential was exactly what the Icathians believed they needed to challenge the seemingly invincible Ascended. The Council of Icathia, recognizing the dangerous opportunity before them, instituted sweeping changes to their government and military structure. They appointed a new Mage King and completely reorganized the Royal Guard, bringing in leaders who were committed to the cause of independence and willing to take whatever risks were necessary to achieve it. Among these new leaders was Syjax, a warrior whose tactical brilliance was matched only by his absolute dedication to Icathian freedom. Not all Icathians supported this dangerous path. Zillion, a chronomancer whose mastery of time magic gave him unique insights into the potential consequences of their actions, pleaded with the council to reconsider their plans. He argued that the void energies they sought to harness were fundamentally hostile to all life, not just to Shuriman rule, and that attempting to use such power would inevitably lead to catastrophe. His warnings, however, fell on deaf ears. The council's commitment to their course became absolute when they declared that merely being Shuriman was now a crime punishable by death or exile. Citizens who had been born in other parts of the empire or who expressed loyalty to the Ascended found themselves branded as traitors and enemies of the state. This purge created a climate of fear and suspicion that infected every aspect of Icathian society, but it also ensured that only the most committed revolutionaries remained in positions of power. As tensions mounted between Icathia and the central government, Shuriman forces began to take notice of the unusual activity in their supposedly loyal province. Reports reached the capital of strange energies being detected near Sabera, of Icathian military units conducting secretive training exercises, and of refugees fleeing the kingdom with tales of persecution and violence. The Ascended recognized these as signs of impending rebellion, but they underestimated both the scale of Icathian preparations and the nature of the power they were attempting to harness. The Empire's response was measured and diplomatic at first, reflecting the Shuriman preference for resolving conflicts through negotiation rather than force. Emissaries were sent to the Icathian Council with offers of greater autonomy within the Empire and guarantees that Icathian traditions and customs would be respected. These overtures were rejected outright, often with insults and threats that made clear how deep Icathian resentment had grown. When diplomatic solutions proved impossible, the Empire began to mobilize its military forces. The decision was made to send a substantial army to Icathia, led by several ascended warriors and commanded by Queen Sataka herself. This force was intended not merely to suppress the rebellion, but to serve as a demonstration of Shuriman power that would deter other provinces from following Icathia's example. The Icathians, aware that conventional forces could never hope to defeat an army led by multiple Ascended, prepared to unleash the weapon they had been developing in secret. As the Shuriman forces approached their borders, Icathian mages began the complex rituals necessary to tear open the void rift they had discovered beneath Sabera. Their plan was ambitious and desperate. They would unleash void energies against the approaching army, using the power of uncreation itself to destroy beings that seemed immune to conventional weapons. The first phase of their plan succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. When the Shuriman army came within range, the Icathians opened the void rift, releasing energies that had been contained since before the creation of the world. The effect on the Ascended warriors was immediate and catastrophic. These beings, who had seemed invincible in every previous conflict, found themselves facing a power that could unravel the very foundations of their existence. The void energies did not simply harm the Ascended. They began to transform them into something monstrous and alien. The cosmic forces that had elevated them to divine status were corrupted and twisted by contact with the primordial nothingness, creating beings that retained their power while losing everything that had made them noble and heroic. Queen Sataka, despite her legendary strength and the protective power of the Chalakar, was among the first to fall to this corruption. As the rift widened and more void energies poured into Runeterra, creatures began to emerge that defied all understanding. These Voidborn were not merely alien, they were antithetical to the very concept of life. Their forms shifted and changed according to principles that had no basis in natural law, and their presence caused reality itself to fray and weaken. Wherever they walked, the land became barren and lifeless, not through destruction, but through the complete absence of the forces that made existence possible. The battle that followed was unlike anything Runeterra had ever witnessed. On one side stood the remaining Shuriman forces, led by ascended warriors who were fighting not just for victory, but for their very existence. On the other side were the Icathians and their void allies, wielding powers that could unmake creation itself. Between them, the fabric of reality served as both battlefield and casualty, torn and wounded by forces that were never meant to interact. As the conflict raged, it became clear that the Icathians had made a terrible miscalculation. The void energies they had unleashed were not weapons that could be controlled and directed. They were forces of pure entropy that consumed everything they encountered. The corruption that had transformed the Ascended began to spread to the Icathians themselves, and the creatures emerging from the rift showed no distinction between friend and enemy in their hunger to unmake existence, recognizing the catastrophic nature of the threat they faced. Some of the surviving Ascended made desperate attempts to contain the damage. Among them was a god warrior from Ikathia itself named Nezuk, whose mastery of elemental magic was unparalleled even among the Ascended. Nezuk proposed to create a weapon of living stone that could fight the void on its own terms, using the ancient Icathian techniques for manipulating earth and stone to craft a fortress that could serve as both weapon and shield. Working with other surviving mages and warriors, Nezuk began construction of what would become known as the Monolith, a massive floating fortress built from living rock and powered by the combined will of its creators. This structure was more than merely a weapon. It was a manifestation of the principle of existence itself, designed to serve as a counterweight to the void's principle of uncreation. For weeks, the monolith battled against the emerging Voidborn, its creators controlling it from within, while it carved through the alien entities with weapons of crystallized matter. The battle took a terrible toll on both the monolith and its creators. The void energies were corrosive to everything they encountered, and even the living stone of the fortress began to erode under their influence. Nezuk and his companions found themselves fighting a losing battle against forces that grew stronger, even as their own weapon weakened. Huge portions of the monolith began to vanish into the void rift, not destroyed, but simply ceasing to exist as if they had never been created at all. The end came when the monolith, weakened beyond its ability to maintain structural integrity, crashed into the earth near the void rift. The impact created additional fractures in reality, allowing even more void energies to pour into Runeterra and opening new pathways for voidborn creatures to emerge. Nezuk, the sole survivor of the fortress's fall, managed to pull himself from the wreckage, but the fragments of his great creation that had vanished into the void were lost forever. Among these lost fragments was a piece that would eventually become significant in its own right. This shard of the monolith, infused with both Nezuk's will and the alien energies of the void, would drift through the spaces between existence for millennia, before eventually manifesting in the physical world as the being known as Malzahar. This future prophet of the void would carry within him both the knowledge of Icathia's fall and the corrupting influence of the Watchers, making him a living bridge between the void and the world of existence. As the battle reached its climax, a final desperate gambit was attempted by the ascended warrior Horok, wielder of a weapon known as the Nether Blade. This artifact, which would later come into the possession of Cassidon, was uniquely suited to combat void entities, for it could cut at the very roots of existence and sever the connections that allowed void-born creatures to maintain their presence in reality. Horok's plan was ambitious and sacrificial. He would venture into the heart of the void rift itself and attempt to seal it from within. The mission required assistance from other Ascended, including the twins Sabak and Sabaka, whose combined powers could create barriers and seals of unprecedented strength. Working together, they managed to contain the worst of the void outbreak, preventing the rift from expanding further and cutting off the flow of new Voidborn into Runeterra. The cost of this success was enormous, as all three Ascended were lost in the process, their life forces consumed in the effort to maintain the seals they had created. The aftermath of the Void War left both Icathia and Shurima in ruins. The kingdom that had sought independence from imperial rule had achieved its goal in the most terrible way possible, becoming a wasteland where nothing could survive the lingering effects of void corruption. The Shuriman army that had come to suppress the rebellion was destroyed, its ascended leaders dead or transformed into monstrous shadows of their former selves. The empire itself, though it survived the immediate crisis, was forever changed by the loss of so many Ascended and the trauma of encountering forces that could challenge their divine power. The confidence and optimism that had characterized the Golden Age began to give way to a more cautious and fearful approach to expansion and governance. The remaining Ascended became more withdrawn and suspicious, recognizing that their power, great as it was, had limits that they had never previously imagined. The void rift beneath Icathia, though contained, was never fully sealed. It remained as a wound in reality, a constant reminder of the dangers inherent in tampering with forces beyond mortal comprehension. Over the centuries, this rift would continue to influence the surrounding region, creating the void that would later spawn new threats and corrupt additional champions in the ongoing struggle between existence and entropy. The knowledge of what had transpired in Icathia spread slowly throughout the known world, carried by refugees and survivors who had witnessed the horrors of the Void War. These accounts, often fragmented and confused by trauma, would influence the development of magical traditions for millennia to come. Many cultures developed strict taboos against certain types of magical research, recognizing that some forms of power were too dangerous to pursue regardless of the potential benefits they might offer. Thus ended the first great age of Shurima, not in glorious conquest or peaceful transition, but in catastrophic defeat at the hands of forces that challenged the very foundations of existence. The empire would survive and even prosper again in later years, but it would never again achieve the same heights of confidence and power that had characterized its golden age. The Void War had proven that even the greatest civilizations could fall when they encountered powers that existed beyond the boundaries of creation itself. In the aftermath of Shurima's catastrophic encounter with the Void, the surviving Ascended found themselves in a world forever changed by forces they had never imagined possible. The golden age of their empire lay in ruins, its capital buried beneath the shifting sands, and its greatest heroes either dead or transformed into monstrous shadows of their former glory. Those god warriors who remained faced a crisis, not merely of leadership, but of identity, for the foundations upon which their entire existence had been built had been shaken to their very core. The Ascended had been created to serve as protectors and guardians, beings of divine power, whose purpose was to ensure the prosperity and security of the Shuriman Empire. With that empire reduced to scattered remnants and its people dispersed across the continent, the surviving god warriors found themselves without clear direction or unified command. The absence of a true emperor, someone who could provide the moral authority and strategic vision necessary to rebuild what had been lost, left them to govern through an uneasy alliance that grew more fragile with each passing year. Initially, the surviving Ascended attempted to maintain the principles and traditions that had guided them during Shurima's golden age. They worked together to protect the remaining cities and settlements, to maintain the trade routes that were essential for economic survival, and to provide the leadership that their mortal subjects desperately needed. For a time, this cooperation proved sufficient to prevent complete collapse, but the strains inherent in their situation gradually began to take their toll. The fundamental problem lay in the nature of ascension itself. The ritual that had transformed these mortals into god warriors had been designed to enhance not only their physical capabilities, but also their strongest personality traits. Virtues such as courage, wisdom, and compassion had been magnified to divine proportions. But so too had their flaws and weaknesses. Ambition, pride, and the desire for dominance, which had been manageable in mortal minds, became overwhelming compulsions when empowered by divine energy. As the years passed and the immediate crisis of the Void War faded into memory, these enhanced negative traits began to assert themselves more strongly. The Ascended found themselves increasingly unable to agree on fundamental questions of governance and policy. Some believed that the empire should be rebuilt exactly as it had been before, with themselves serving as benevolent guardians of a restored mortal civilization. Others argued that the failures of the past proved the need for more direct divine rule, with the Ascended taking complete control over every aspect of their subjects' lives. The most dangerous faction among the surviving god warriors consisted of those who had been most severely affected by their encounters with void corruption. Although they had not been completely transformed like their fallen comrades, they carried within them traces of the alien influence that had destroyed so many others. This corruption manifested not as physical mutation, but as a gradual erosion of the moral constraints that had once guided their behavior. These, partially corrupted, ascended, began to develop philosophies that justified increasingly extreme actions. They argued that mortals, having proven themselves incapable of resisting the temptation to meddle with forces beyond their understanding, could no longer be trusted with self-governance. The Icathian rebellion and its catastrophic consequences were cited as evidence that only beings of divine wisdom could make the difficult decisions necessary to prevent future disasters. From this philosophical foundation, it was a relatively short step to the conclusion that mortals should be treated not as subjects to be protected, but as resources to be managed. The Ascended began to view themselves not as servants of the Empire, but as its rightful owners, entitled to command absolute obedience from the lesser beings who depended on their protection. The bonds of mutual respect and obligation that had once connected the God Warriors to their people began to dissolve, replaced by relationships based purely on power and dominance. As this transformation progressed, the Ascended ceased to be known by the honorific titles they had earned through their heroic deeds. Instead, they became known as the Darken, a term that reflected both their fallen nature and the dark influence that had corrupted them. The word itself carried connotations of shadow and corruption, suggesting beings who had turned away from the light they had once served and embraced something far more sinister. The Darken's transformation was not merely philosophical, but physical as well. Over time, they began to experiment with their own forms, using ancient magics to merge their flesh with their armor and weapons, until they became unified entities of living metal and corrupted tissue. This process created beings that were no longer recognizably humanoid, monstrous creatures whose very appearance reflected the darkness that had consumed their souls. Among the most prominent of these fallen god warriors was Aatrox, who had once been numbered among the greatest heroes of the Ascended. His fall was perhaps the most tragic, because his original nature had been so noble and selfless. Aatrox had been a being of pure compassion, someone who felt the pain of others as if it were his own, and who had dedicated his existence to protecting those who could not protect themselves. The void corruption had taken this capacity for empathy and twisted it into something monstrous, turning his love for life into a hatred of existence itself. The transformation of Aatrox exemplified the broader tragedy of the Darken. He retained his power and much of his intelligence, but the moral framework that had once guided his actions had been completely inverted. Where he had once sought to preserve life, he now sought to end it, viewing death as a mercy that would spare beings the suffering inherent in existence. His great blade, which had once defended the innocent, became an instrument of slaughter that hungered for blood and carnage. Another prominent Darken was the entity that would later be known as Rust, whose corruption had taken a different but equally destructive form. Where Aatrox had become consumed with the desire to end suffering through death, Rast had become obsessed with the concept of perfection through dominance. He viewed all other forms of consciousness as flawed and imperfect. worthy only of being conquered and controlled. His weapon became a scythe that could slice through both flesh and spirit, allowing him to harvest not just lives, but the very essence of his victims. The Darkin, known as Varus, represented yet another form of corruption, one that focused on the concept of retribution and vengeance. His transformation had been driven by a desire to punish those he viewed as responsible for the fall of Shurima. But this desire had grown to encompass virtually all of creation. In his corrupted perception, every being was guilty of some transgression that deserved punishment, and he became a judge whose only sentence was death. As the Darkin consolidated their power and began to rule their territories through fear and intimidation, they inevitably came into conflict with one another. Each believed that their particular vision of how the world should be ordered was the correct one, and none was willing to subordinate themselves to their former comrades. The result was a series of wars that raged across multiple continents, conflicts that made the original Void War seem almost restrained by comparison. These wars were characterized by a level of brutality and destruction that surpassed anything the world had previously witnessed. The Darkin wielded not only their personal power, but also the advanced magical technologies of ancient Shurima, creating weapons and tactics that could devastate entire regions. Worse still, their conflicts were not limited to military targets, but extended to civilian populations, for each Darkin sought to demonstrate their superiority by completely destroying anything associated with their rivals. The mortal populations caught between these warring god warriors found themselves in an impossible situation. They lacked the power to resist the Darkin directly, but remaining neutral was often interpreted as support for one faction or another, making them targets for retaliation. Entire civilizations were wiped out, not because they had chosen the wrong side in these conflicts, but simply because they had the misfortune to exist in territories claimed by opposing Darkin. In some regions, mortal leaders attempted to form alliances with specific Darkin in hopes of gaining protection from their rivals. These partnerships typically proved disastrous, as the Darkin viewed their mortal allies as expendable resources rather than valued partners. Kingdoms that had sought protection often found themselves enslaved, their people forced to serve in armies that would be sacrificed without hesitation to achieve their master's objectives. One of the most tragic examples of such an alliance occurred in the ancient kingdom of Camivore, where the ruling nobility made a pact with a powerful Darkin in exchange for protection from external threats. As part of this agreement, they offered one of their own, a young nobleman named Vladimir, to serve as a symbol of their loyalty and commitment. The Darkin accepted this offering and began to train Vladimir in the dark arts of blood magic, techniques that allowed the manipulation of life force itself. The corruption of Vladimir proceeded gradually, so slowly that neither he nor his family initially recognized what was happening to him. The blood magic he learned seemed merely to be another form of combat training, a way of enhancing his natural abilities to better serve his kingdom. Only when he had been completely transformed did the true nature of his education become apparent. The Darkin had not simply taught him magical techniques, but had fundamentally altered his nature, making him into a creature that sustained itself by consuming the life force of others. When Vladimir returned to Kamavor after completing his training, he carried within him both the knowledge and the compulsion to practice the arts he had learned. The kingdom that had sacrificed him to gain protection found itself under attack from within, as their former champion began to systematically drain the life from his own people. The irony was bitter and complete, for in seeking to save their realm from external threats, they had allowed an even greater danger to take root at its very heart. Vladimir's transformation also demonstrated the insidious nature of darkened corruption. Unlike the void energies that had created obvious monsters during the Icathian conflict, the influence of the fallen ascended was subtle and seductive. It offered power and knowledge that seemed beneficial, revealing its true cost only after the corruption had become irreversible. By the time victims realized what had been done to them, they had often become willing participants in spreading the same corruption to others. As the Darken Wars continued to rage, it became increasingly clear that some form of intervention would be necessary to prevent the complete destruction of civilized life on Runeterra. The god warriors had proven themselves incapable of self-restraint or compromise, and their conflicts showed no signs of reaching any natural conclusion. If anything, the wars seemed to be intensifying as each Darken sought to gain a decisive advantage over their rivals. The intervention that eventually came was neither military nor diplomatic, but celestial in nature. The aspects of Mount Targon, cosmic entities that had long observed the affairs of mortals from their distant realm, recognized that the Darken represented a threat not just to Runeterra, but potentially to the stability of creation itself. Their corruption bore too many similarities to void influence to be ignored, and their wars risked creating conditions that might allow other dark forces to gain footholds in the physical world. The aspect of war, which had been seeking a suitable mortal host for millennia, finally chose to intervene directly in the conflict, taking possession of a worthy champion. The aspect began to organize resistance to the Darken, uniting scattered mortal populations under a banner that could provide hope for victory against seemingly invincible enemies. This marked the beginning of a new phase in the war, one in which mortals would have access to truly divine power in their struggle against the fallen god warriors. The chosen champion of the war aspect proved to be a brilliant military leader whose tactical genius was enhanced by celestial knowledge and power. Under their guidance, the scattered opponents of the Darken began to coordinate their efforts, sharing intelligence about their enemies' weaknesses and developing strategies that could exploit the rivalries between different factions. For the first time since the wars had begun, the Darken found themselves facing organized opposition that could match their individual power through superior coordination and planning. Meanwhile, in the distant kingdom of Kamavor, Vladimir had grown tired of serving his Darken master and began to contemplate rebellion. His transformation had given him not only the power to drain life force, but also a form of immortality that made him confident he could survive any confrontation. When his master commanded him to lead their armies against the new coalition of mortal forces, Vladimir saw an opportunity to achieve independence while eliminating a rival source of power. The betrayal was swift and decisive. Vladimir used his knowledge of blood magic to weaken his master at a crucial moment, then struck with weapons specifically designed to wound Darkin. The battle was brief but intense, ending with the destruction of Vladimir's former mentor and the absorption of much of their power into Vladimir's own being. This act of treachery not only freed Vladimir from servitude, but also made him effectively immortal, sustained by the consumed essence of a fallen god warrior. Vladimir's betrayal was not unique, as other mortal servants of the Darkin began to recognize that their master's attention was focused on fighting each other rather than maintaining control over their territories. Rebellions erupted across multiple regions, often led by individuals who had learned to use their master's own techniques against them. While most of these uprisings were ultimately unsuccessful, they contributed to the growing chaos that made coordinated Darkin resistance increasingly difficult. The turning point in the war came when the celestial forces managed to gather several of the most powerful Darkin into a single location, using carefully crafted intelligence reports to convince each faction that their rivals were planning a massive assault. The trap was elegant in its simplicity, for it relied on the Darkin's own paranoia and competitiveness to bring them together in circumstances where they could be confronted by superior numbers. The battle that followed was one of the most destructive conflicts in Runeterra's history, a confrontation between divine powers that reshaped the landscape and left scars that would be visible for millennia. The aspect of war and their mortal allies fought with desperate courage, knowing that failure would mean not just their own destruction, but the continuation of the Darkin's reign of terror. The fallen god warriors, caught off guard by the scale and coordination of the attack, found themselves unable to retreat or call for reinforcements. The climax of the battle came when the previous host of the Twilight aspect, a figure whose name has been lost to history, made the ultimate sacrifice, drawing upon both their own life force and the power granted by their celestial patron. They channeled the Chalikar's cosmic energies into an attack that killed or severely wounded most of the Darkin present. The effort cost both the Aspect's host and several mortal heroes their lives, but it broke the power of the fallen god warriors and made possible their ultimate defeat. However, the Darkin proved impossible to kill permanently through conventional means. Their divine nature made them resistant to destruction, and even when their physical forms were shattered, their consciousness and power remained intact. Recognizing this challenge, the surviving Twilight aspect worked with master weaponsmiths to develop a solution that drew upon both celestial knowledge and mortal craftsmanship. The weapons created through this collaboration were more than mere tools. They were prisons specifically designed to contain divine consciousness. Each blade, spear, or bow was crafted with binding enchantments that could trap the Darkin's essence while preventing them from influencing the physical world. The process of sealing the fallen god warriors into these weapons was dangerous and exhausting, requiring precise timing and absolute commitment from those who performed the ritual. One by one, the surviving Darkin were hunted down and trapped within weapons that would serve as their eternal prisons. Aatrox found himself bound within a great sword whose blade thirsted for blood and conflict. Rost was sealed into a scythe that would wait millennia for a worthy wielder. Varus became part of a bow that contained his essence while preventing him from acting independently. Each weapon carried within it both the power and the corruption of its imprisoned occupant, making them items of incredible potential and terrible danger. The sealing of the Darkin marked the end of an era that had begun with such promise and ended in such tragedy. The Ascended, who had once represented the highest achievements of mortal cooperation with divine power, had fallen so far that their very names became synonymous with corruption and evil. Their wars had devastated entire continents and set back the progress of civilization by centuries. Yet, even in their defeat, the Darkin left a legacy that would influence Runeterra for millennia to come. The weapons that contained them would eventually be discovered by new generations of mortals, creating the possibility that their corruption might spread once again. The techniques of blood magic that Vladimir had learned would be passed down through secret traditions, influencing dark practitioners for generations. Most significantly, the memory of how quickly divine power could be corrupted would shape the relationship between mortals and the supernatural for the rest of recorded history. The world that emerged from the Darkin Wars was one marked by both caution and hope. The threat of the fallen god warriors had been contained, but at enormous cost in lives and destruction. The survivors faced the challenge of rebuilding not just their physical communities, but their faith in the possibility of beneficial relationships between mortal and divine power. It would take centuries for civilization to recover from the trauma of this period, and some regions would never fully heal from the wounds inflicted during these dark years. Far from the ancient battlefields where Darkin had once raged against both mortals and each other, in the distant continent of Camivore, a different kind of tragedy was beginning to unfold. This was a story not of divine corruption or cosmic forces, but of the most human of emotions carried to their most destructive extreme: love. That force which poets claimed could move mountains and inspire the greatest heroic deeds would prove capable of unleashing horrors that rivaled even the devastation of the Void Wars. The kingdom of Camivore had long prided itself on its traditions of honor, chivalry, and noble governance. For generations, its rulers had maintained a delicate balance between the various noble houses, ensuring prosperity through careful diplomacy and measured expansion. The kingdom's strength lay not in military might alone, but in the loyalty and dedication of its people, who genuinely believed in the righteousness of their cause and the wisdom of their leaders. King Viego had ascended to the throne during a period of relative peace and stability, inheriting a realm that seemed destined for continued prosperity. He was, by most accounts, a competent ruler whose primary weakness lay in his tendency toward emotional extremes. When Viego loved, he loved with an intensity that bordered on obsession. When he hated, his fury could drive him to acts of startling cruelty. These traits, which might have been mere personality quirks in a private citizen, became dangerous liabilities when coupled with absolute royal authority. The transformation of Viego from beloved king to tyrant began with what should have been the happiest moment of his life: his marriage to Isolde, a seamstress whose beauty and gentle nature had captured his heart completely. Their courtship had been brief but passionate, and their wedding was celebrated throughout the kingdom as a symbol of hope and renewal. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed that Camivore had found in its royal couple the perfect embodiment of its highest ideals. Isolde herself was everything that Viego was not: gentle where he was forceful, patient where he was impulsive, compassionate where he could be cruel. Her influence on the king was immediately apparent to those who served in the royal court. Under her guidance, Viego became more thoughtful in his decisions, more willing to listen to advice, and more concerned with the welfare of his subjects than with the aggrandizement of his own power. However, this newfound balance came at a cost that was not immediately apparent. Viego's obsession with his wife gradually began to eclipse all other considerations. He spent hours each day in her company, neglecting the routine business of governance in favor of elaborate romantic gestures and intimate conversations. State meetings were postponed or canceled entirely when they conflicted with the king's desire to spend time with his queen. The nobles and administrators who had served Camivore faithfully for decades found themselves increasingly excluded from meaningful participation in government. Important decisions were made not based on careful consideration of their implications, but on Viego's assessment of how they might affect his wife's happiness. Trade agreements were signed or rejected based on whether they would allow the king to purchase exotic gifts for Isolde. Military appointments were made to reward those who had complimented the queen's beauty or intelligence. As the months passed, the kingdom's administration began to suffer from this benign neglect. Border disputes that should have been resolved through diplomacy were allowed to fester until they required military intervention. Economic policies that needed regular adjustment to respond to changing conditions remained static, causing hardship for merchants and farmers alike. Most seriously, the network of alliances and obligations that had long protected Camivore from external threats began to deteriorate as the king's attention was focused entirely inward. The crisis that would ultimately destroy both the kingdom and its royal couple came from an entirely unexpected direction. A group of assassins, their identity and motivations lost to history, managed to infiltrate the royal palace and launch an attack on the king and queen. The assault was expertly planned and executed, suggesting that the attackers possessed detailed knowledge of the palace's defenses and the royal couple's daily routines. Callista, Viego's niece and one of the kingdom's most skilled warriors, happened to be visiting the palace when the attack occurred. Her quick thinking and exceptional combat abilities saved the king's life. But she could not prevent Isolde from being struck by a poisoned blade. The weapon had been coated with a toxin so exotic and potent that the kingdom's finest physicians and healers were baffled by its effects. As Isolde's condition steadily worsened, despite all efforts to save her, Viego's obsession with his wife transformed into a desperate mania that consumed every aspect of his personality. He commanded his servants to scour the known world for any remedy, no matter how unlikely or expensive. Scholars were summoned from distant lands to research ancient texts for references to similar poisons. Merchants were offered fortunes for magical artifacts that might possess healing properties. When conventional medicine failed, Viego turned to increasingly exotic alternatives. Alchemists experimented with dangerous compounds that often proved more harmful than helpful. Mystics attempted to channel spiritual energies that they barely understood. The king's willingness to try anything, no matter how desperate or dangerous, created a climate of frantic experimentation that often put both the queen and those trying to help her at additional risk. As word of the queen's condition spread beyond Camavore's borders, rumors began to circulate about a legendary source of healing that might be capable of curing even the most hopeless cases. These stories spoke of the Blessed Isles, a mystical archipelago where the very waters possessed the power to restore life to the dying. The tales were fragmentary and contradictory, but they offered something that no other option could provide: hope. Callista, driven by her own guilt over her failure to protect the queen and her genuine love for both Viego and Isolde, volunteered to undertake the perilous journey to the Blessed Isles. The voyage would be dangerous in the extreme, requiring navigation through treacherous waters and past hostile territories. Moreover, the Blessed Isles were known to be protected by powerful magical defenses that prevented unauthorized visitors from reaching their shores. The expedition that Callista assembled included some of Camavore's finest warriors and most experienced sailors. Captain Venex, whose knowledge of distant waters was unparalleled, agreed to guide the mission despite the obvious dangers. The ship they selected, the Daggerhawk, was one of the fastest and most seaworthy vessels in the royal fleet, equipped with the latest navigational instruments and defensive armaments. The journey to the Blessed Isles proved even more hazardous than anticipated. Mysterious mists surrounded the archipelago, creating navigational hazards that conventional instruments could not penetrate. When the expedition attempted to reach the islands using traditional sailing techniques, they found themselves lost in a magical fog that seemed to actively prevent their approach. Desperate for guidance, Callista turned to local traders and adventurers who might possess knowledge of alternative routes to the islands. Among these was a merchant named Radu Feros, whose reputation was questionable, but whose claims about knowing secret passages to the Blessed Isles were backed by apparently authentic charts and artifacts. The agreement Callista made with Radu Feros would prove to be one of the most fateful decisions in Runeterra's history. In exchange for his guidance, she promised him a substantial portion of the Camavorian royal treasury, along with favorable trading rights that would make him wealthy beyond imagination. More importantly, she agreed to trust his judgment about the best approach to take when requesting aid from the inhabitants of the Blessed Isles. Radu's true motivations became apparent only after the expedition had committed itself to following his guidance. Rather than leading them directly to the Blessed Isles, he took them on a circuitous route that brought them into contact with various other settlements and individuals. At each stop, He claimed that additional preparations or consultations were necessary, while secretly arranging for his own associates to rob and murder members of the expedition. The betrayal reached its climax when Radu's men launched a coordinated attack on the Dagger Hawk while it was anchored near a supposedly friendly port. Captain Venex and most of the crew were killed in the fighting, leaving Callista with only a handful of survivors and no clear way to continue their mission. Worse still, their supplies had been largely depleted, and their ship had been damaged beyond their ability to repair. In this moment of absolute despair, an unexpected opportunity presented itself. A ship under attack by Vestaya pirates crossed their path, and Callista made the desperate decision to intervene in the conflict. The battle was brief but intense, with the survivors of her expedition fighting alongside the threatened vessel's crew to drive off their attackers. Among the passengers on the rescued ship was Tyrus, a scholar and adept from the Blessed Isles themselves, along with his apprentice, Rise. These men possessed not only detailed knowledge of the island's defenses, but also the magical tools necessary to penetrate them safely. Most remarkably, their ship bore a figurehead that matched exactly the description of a golden maiden that had appeared in prophetic visions experienced by several members of Callista's expedition. Tyrus was initially reluctant to assist Callista's mission, recognizing that the waters of life she sought were not meant for casual use by outsiders. The magical springs of the Blessed Isles were sacred treasures that had been protected for millennia, and their guardians took their responsibilities seriously. However, the desperation in Callista's plea and the obvious nobility of her cause eventually convinced him to make an exception to the island's usual policies. Using a magical waystone, Tyrus guided the remnants of Callista's expedition through the mystical barriers that protected the Blessed Isles. The journey through the enchanted mists was unlike anything the Camavorians had ever experienced, as reality itself seemed to shift and flow around them. Time moved differently within the protective barriers, and distance became a fluid concept that bore little relationship to conventional navigation. When they finally emerged from the mists, Callista and her companions found themselves in a realm that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time and space. The Blessed Isles were more beautiful than any description could have conveyed, with landscapes that changed subtly with the observer's mood, and buildings that seemed to have grown rather than been constructed. The very air was suffused with magical energies that promoted healing and growth. The capital city of Helia was a marvel of organic architecture and natural beauty, where structures of living, coral, and crystallized song housed inhabitants who moved with the grace of beings unencumbered by mortal concerns. The Council of Helia, which governed the islands, consisted of individuals whose wisdom had been accumulated over centuries of careful study and contemplation. Callista's request for the waters of life was received with sympathy, but also with considerable concern. The council members understood the noble motivations behind her mission, but they also recognized the dangerous precedent that would be set if they granted access to their most sacred resource based purely on emotional appeal. The waters of life were not merely healing agents, but sources of power that could be misused if they fell into the wrong hands. The debates within the council stretched on for days, during which Callista found herself growing increasingly desperate as she imagined Isolde's condition continuing to deteriorate. To occupy her time and learn more about the magical traditions of the islands, she was introduced to various artisans and scholars who were willing to share their knowledge with respectful visitors. Among these was Gendea, a master artificer whose specialty was the creation of relic weapons capable of channeling and focusing magical energies. These devices represented a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between consciousness and magical force, allowing skilled users to achieve effects that would normally require years of training and study. The weapons were not merely tools, but partners in the casting process, amplifying and refining their wielders' natural abilities. After a week of deliberation, the council delivered their decision. They would not grant Callista's request for the waters of life. Their reasoning was sound but devastating to her hope. The waters required the presence of the person to be healed during the healing ritual, and Isolde was far too ill to survive the journey to the Blessed Isles. Moreover, the council had concerns about the precedent that would be set by granting such a request to foreign royalty. Heartbroken but not entirely defeated, Callista prepared to return to Camivore with the terrible news that her mission had failed. However, as she made her final preparations for departure, she was approached by an unexpected ally, Thresh, who at that time served as the Warden of Thresholds and was responsible for maintaining the magical barriers that protected the islands, offered her a secret alternative. Thresh claimed to be moved by the nobility of her cause and the depth of her devotion to her family. He provided her with a small vial of the waters of life, along with a magical waystone that would allow her to navigate back to Camivore safely. In exchange, he asked only that she remember his assistance and consider him a friend of the Camivorian royal house. What Callista could not have known was that Thresh's motivations were far from altruistic. The Warden had long harbored ambitions to expand his influence beyond the Blessed Isles, and he saw the desperate Camivorian situation as an opportunity to gain a foothold in a powerful kingdom. The waters of life he provided were genuine, but the waystone carried with it magical tracers that would allow him to monitor and potentially influence events in Camivore. The return journey to Camivore was swifter than the outbound voyage had been, aided by the magical properties of Thresh's waystone. However, when Callista finally reached the royal palace, she found a situation far worse than she had feared. Isolde had indeed died during her absence, but rather than accepting this tragedy and beginning the process of mourning, Viego had descended into a madness that threatened the stability of the entire kingdom. The king had locked himself in the tower with Isolde's body, using magical preservation techniques to prevent decomposition while he frantically searched for ways to restore her to life. The court physicians who had initially tried to dissuade him from this course of action had been imprisoned or exiled. The nobles who had attempted to assume governmental responsibilities in his absence had been branded as traitors and faced similar fates. Most alarmingly, Viego had begun to implement increasingly desperate and destructive policies in his search for a solution to his wife's death. He had bankrupted the royal treasury purchasing magical artifacts and hiring practitioners of dubious reputation. He had launched military campaigns against neighboring kingdoms suspected of harboring resources that might aid in resurrection. He had instituted a reign of terror against his own subjects, convinced that enemies and conspirators were working to prevent Isolde's return. Callista found herself in an impossible position. She possessed the waters of life that might have saved Isolde had she arrived in time, but she also recognized that Viego's madness had progressed to a point where any attempt to restore his wife might create an even greater catastrophe. The king's obsession had transformed from loving devotion into something monstrous and destructive, and there was no guarantee that success in his quest would restore his sanity. The moral dilemma was further complicated by the practical realities of the situation. Camivor was effectively in a state of civil war, with different factions supporting either the king's increasingly irrational commands or the nobles who sought to restore some semblance of normal governance. Foreign enemies had begun to take advantage of the kingdom's internal chaos, launching raids and territorial encroachments that would have been unthinkable during the days of stable royal rule. After much agonizing consideration, Callista made the decision that would ultimately lead to her own destruction and the devastation of everything she had tried to protect. She chose to conceal the existence of the waters of life from Viego, recognizing that his current state of mind made him unfit to make rational decisions about their use. Instead, she hoped to gradually restore his sanity through careful counseling and the support of loyal friends. This decision proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. When Viego discovered that Callista had returned from her journey with exactly what he needed, but had chosen to withhold it from him, his fury transcended all bounds of reason or restraint. He branded her a traitor of the highest order and commanded that she be imprisoned and tortured until she revealed the location of any other healing resources she might have discovered. The imprisonment and torture of Callista marked the final transformation of Viego from grieving husband into tyrannical monster. The king, who had once been beloved by his people for his passion and dedication, had become a creature driven entirely by obsession and rage. Under the direction of Hecarim, the commander of the Iron Order, Callista was subjected to torments designed not merely to extract information, but to punish her for what Viego saw as the ultimate betrayal. The final act of this tragedy began when Viego, having finally broken Callista's spirit through prolonged torture, forced her to guide a new expedition to the Blessed Isles. This journey was unlike the previous mission in every way. Where Callista's original voyage had been motivated by love and hope, this expedition was driven by madness and revenge. The king brought with him not only Hecarim and the Iron Order, but also Isolde's preserved corpse, determined to force the inhabitants of the Blessed Isles to restore his wife to life. The arrival of the Camivorian fleet at the Blessed Isles marked the beginning of the end for one of Runeterra's most beautiful and peaceful realms. Viego's demands were met with the same patient refusal that had been given to Callista, but his response was far different from hers. Rather than accepting the council's decision he commanded his forces to attack, beginning a siege that would ultimately destroy everything the islanders had spent millennia creating and protecting. The battle for Helia was brutal and one-sided. The inhabitants of the Blessed Isles were scholars and artisans, not warriors, and their magical defenses had been designed to exclude unwanted visitors rather than repel military invasions. Against the disciplined brutality of the Iron Order, they had little chance of mounting an effective resistance. As the city fell and its defenders were overwhelmed, Viego and Thresh made their way to the Well of Ages, the most sacred site on the Blessed Isles and the source of the waters of life that had made the islands famous throughout the known world. Here, in the heart of a realm dedicated to healing and growth, the Mad King would attempt to undo the fundamental law that separated life from death. The ritual that Viego performed at the Well of Ages was an abomination that violated every principle of natural magic and cosmic order. By submerging Isolde's corpse in the sacred waters while channeling his own obsessive love through dark, magical techniques, he created a resonance that destabilized the very foundations of reality in the surrounding area. The immediate result was exactly what Viego had hoped for. Isolde's body showed signs of returning life, her eyes opening and her chest beginning to rise and fall with the rhythm of breathing. However, the queen who emerged from the waters was not the gentle, loving woman who had once brought peace to a troubled king. The process of resurrection had fundamentally altered her nature, transforming her into a wraith filled with rage and confusion. The Isolde who rose from the Well of Ages was consumed with fury at what had been done to her and to the innocent people who had died to make her resurrection possible. In her first act upon returning to consciousness, she seized Viego's own enchanted blade and drove it through his heart, killing the husband whose obsessive love had doomed them both. The death of Viego, while he was channeling such massive amounts of corrupted magical energy, created a catastrophic chain reaction that spread outward from the Well of Ages like a plague of spiritual destruction. The Black Mist, as this phenomenon came to be known, was not merely a physical manifestation, but a corruption of the very concept of death itself. Wherever the Black Mist touched, the boundaries between life and death became blurred and permeable. The recently deceased rose as undead creatures driven by the same obsessive emotions that had motivated Viego. The living found their life force drained away, leaving them as hollow shells animated only by whatever desires had been strongest at the moment of their corruption. The transformation of the Blessed Isles into the Shadow Isles was swift and complete. Within hours, a realm that had been dedicated to healing and growth had become a nightmare landscape where death and undeath ruled supreme. The survivors of the initial catastrophe found themselves trapped in a realm where the normal rules of existence no longer applied, forced to witness the destruction of everything they had spent their lives protecting and nurturing. Among the few who managed to escape the immediate devastation were Jendea, Rise, and Captain Venix, protected by Tyrus's magic during the crucial first hours of the corruption. These survivors would go on to found new traditions dedicated to combating the threat of the black mist. But they could never undo the damage that had been done or restore what had been lost. The effects of the ruination, as historians would later call this catastrophe, were not limited to the former Blessed Isles. Across Runeterra, individuals and communities reported strange phenomena associated with death and undeath. Graveyards became restless, with the recently buried sometimes clawing their way back to the surface. Spirits that had previously been content to remain in whatever afterlife awaited them began to manifest in the physical world, often seeking to complete unfinished business or settle old grievances. The psychological impact of the ruination was perhaps even more significant than its immediate physical effects. The knowledge that death itself could be corrupted and twisted challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence and the afterlife. Religious traditions across the world were forced to grapple with questions they had never previously considered, while scholars and philosophers debated the implications of what had occurred. In the decades following the ruination, the transformed Shadow Isles became a source of periodic terror for the rest of Runeterra. The black mist would periodically surge outward from its source, bringing undeath and corruption to distant shores in events known as harrowings. These supernatural storms could devastate entire regions, turning thriving communities into ghost towns, populated only by the restless dead. The story of Viego and Isolde became a cautionary tale told throughout the known world, a reminder of how even the noblest emotions could become destructive when taken to unhealthy extremes. Love, devotion, and loyalty were still celebrated as virtues, but the fate of Camivore served as a warning about the importance of maintaining balance and perspective even in the face of the most devastating losses. Thus, from the depths of personal tragedy arose a threat that would plague Runeterra for millennia to come. The Shadow Isles stood as a monument to the destructive potential of unchecked obsession, while the periodic harrowings served as reminders that some wounds once inflicted upon the world could never be fully healed. The price of Viego's love had been paid not only by himself and his kingdom, but by countless innocents who would suffer the consequences of his choices for generations to come. In the wake of the great catastrophes that had reshaped Runeterra, scattered survivors across multiple continents began the long and difficult process of rebuilding civilization from the ashes of what had been lost. The ruination had sent shockwaves through the collective consciousness of the world's peoples, while the memory of the Darken Wars served as a constant reminder of how quickly divine power could become corrupted and turn against those it was meant to protect. From these harsh lessons would emerge new forms of governance, new philosophies of magic and power, and new nations that would come to define the modern era. The most dramatic transformation occurred in the coastal region, where the prosperous city of Ashra-Vazon had once stood as a beacon of engineering excellence and commercial prosperity. The ambitious project to create a shipping passage between the eastern and western seas of Valoran had been conceived during an era of optimism and technological confidence, when the city's leaders believed that human ingenuity could overcome any natural obstacle and reshape the world according to their vision. The plan itself was elegant in its simplicity, and staggering in its scope. By using thousands of chemtech explosives placed with mathematical precision, the engineers of Ashra Bazan intended to blast through the narrow isthmus that connected the northern and southern portions of the continent. The resulting canal would allow ships to travel between the Guardian Sea and the Conqueror's Sea without making the dangerous journey around the continent's southern tip, creating unprecedented opportunities for trade and cultural exchange. The project represented the culmination of centuries of advancement in both magical and mundane engineering. The chemtech explosives that would make the excavation possible were marvels of alchemical science, designed to channel destructive forces with unprecedented precision and control. The timing mechanisms that would coordinate their detonation had been crafted by the finest artificers in the known world, incorporating principles of clockwork mechanics that pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible. When the moment of detonation finally arrived, the initial results seemed to confirm the engineers' most optimistic projections. The explosions carved through solid rock as if it were soft clay, creating a channel that immediately began to fill with seawater from both sides. For a brief, glorious moment, it appeared that one of the most ambitious engineering projects in recorded history had succeeded beyond its creator's wildest dreams. However, the forces unleashed by such massive explosions proved impossible to control completely. The carefully calculated blast pattern, which had been designed to remove precisely the right amount of material to create a stable waterway, instead triggered a catastrophic earthquake that far exceeded the engineers' ability to predict or contain. The geological instability spread outward from the detonation site like ripples on a pond, affecting structures and landscapes far beyond the intended excavation area. The earthquake's most devastating impact fell upon Ashra Bazan itself. The city, which had been built on foundations that were stable under normal circumstances, found itself subjected to seismic forces that no amount of engineering foresight could have anticipated. Buildings that had stood for centuries collapsed in minutes, their sophisticated architecture proving helpless against the fundamental instability of the earth beneath them. Worse still, the underground chambers where the city's alchemical workshops and laboratories were housed suffered catastrophic breaches that released toxic chemicals and magical compounds into the air and groundwater. These substances, which had been carefully contained during normal operations, created a poisonous miasma that threatened to kill anyone who remained in the affected areas. The very innovations that had made Ashra Bazan prosperous became the instruments of its destruction. As the immediate crisis unfolded, it became clear that thousands of citizens were trapped in the lower districts of the city, areas that had been carved into the bedrock to provide space for industrial operations and worker housing. The earthquake had caused massive cave-ins that blocked most of the conventional escape routes, while the rising toxic fumes made the remaining passages increasingly dangerous to traverse. In this moment of absolute despair, salvation came from an unexpected source. Jana, the wind spirit, who had been worshipped by the city's sailors and merchants for generations, manifested her power on a scale that few had ever witnessed, drawing upon the faith and desperate prayers of her followers. She summoned winds of incredible force and precision, creating currents that could blow away the toxic gases, while providing breathable air to those trapped below. The intervention of Jana was more than merely a rescue operation. It was a demonstration of the profound connection that could exist between a community and the spiritual forces that watched over it. The wind spirit's action saved thousands of lives that would otherwise have been lost, but they also established a precedent for divine intervention in mortal affairs that would influence the development of the surviving community for generations to come. The immediate aftermath of the disaster saw the emergence of two distinct communities from the ruins of the original city. Those who had lived in the upper districts, primarily merchants and nobles who had possessed the resources to build homes above ground level, began the process of reconstruction with characteristic determination and optimism. They viewed the catastrophe as a temporary setback rather than a permanent defeat, and they were confident that their superior knowledge and resources would allow them to rebuild something even grander than what had been lost. These upper city survivors focused their efforts on controlling and profiting from the new waterway that had been created by the explosion. Despite the terrible cost in lives and destruction, the canal itself functioned exactly as intended, providing the trade advantages that had motivated the original project. By establishing control over the passage fees and docking rights, the reconstructed community could generate enormous wealth from the commercial traffic that would inevitably flow through their territory. Meanwhile, those who had survived in the lower districts faced a very different set of challenges and opportunities. The toxic environment created by the industrial disaster had made large portions of their former home uninhabitable, forcing them to adapt to conditions that would have been unthinkable before the catastrophe. However, these same harsh conditions also created unique opportunities for those who could learn to exploit them. The alchemical compounds that had poisoned the air and water possessed properties that could be harnessed by those with sufficient knowledge and skill. Chemtech, as these substances came to be known, offered possibilities for enhancement and augmentation that normal technology could not match. The survivors who learned to work with these dangerous materials found themselves capable of achievements that would have been impossible under ordinary circumstances. The division between the upper and lower communities was not merely geographical, but philosophical and cultural as well. The reconstructed upper city, which would eventually take the name Piltover, embraced ideals of progress, prosperity, and technological advancement. Its inhabitants believed that human ingenuity and determination could overcome any obstacle, and they viewed the successful completion of the waterway project as proof of their fundamental superiority over those who had been less fortunate. Piltover's development was rapid and impressive, driven by the enormous wealth generated by control of the new trade route. The city's merchants and inventors collaborated to create innovations that revolutionized transportation, communication, and manufacturing. The Hextech crystals that had been discovered in various locations around Runeterra proved particularly important to these efforts, providing sources of clean, controllable magical energy that could power sophisticated devices and machinery. The establishment of Progress Day as an annual celebration marked Piltover's commitment to the principles of advancement and innovation. This holiday commemorated not only the anniversary of the Sun Gate's opening, but also the broader philosophy that had guided the city's reconstruction. Progress Day became a symbol of Piltover's identity, representing their belief that any problem could be solved through the application of sufficient intelligence and resources. In stark contrast, the community that developed in the lower levels, which retained the ancient name of Zaun, evolved according to very different principles. The harsh conditions of their environment had taught them that survival required adaptation rather than domination, and that prosperity often came through embracing change rather than trying to control it. Zaunites learned to find value in things that others discarded, to make use of resources that others considered worthless or dangerous. The relationship between Piltover and Zaun was complex and often contentious, shaped by their shared history and their very different approaches to progress and prosperity. Piltover's wealth depended in large part on the industrial production that took place in Zaun's workshops and factories, while Zaun's survival often required access to resources and opportunities that were controlled by Piltover's elite. This mutual dependence created tensions that would persist for centuries, as each community struggled to maintain its identity while accommodating the needs and demands of the other. The emergence of these twin cities marked the beginning of a new era in Runeterra's development, one in which technological advancement would play an increasingly important role in determining the balance of power between nations and cultures. The innovations pioneered in Piltover and Zaun would influence military technology, transportation systems, and communication networks throughout the known world, while the philosophical differences between the two communities would provide models for very different approaches to modernization and progress. Far to the north, in the aftermath of the ancient conflicts that had shaped the Freljord, a very different kind of nation was taking shape around the remnants of Mordekaiser's former empire. The Immortal Bastion, which had served as the Iron Tyrant's seat of power, had survived the centuries that followed his banishment to the Death Realm. The structure itself seemed to embody principles of endurance and dominance that transcended any individual ruler, providing a foundation around which the scattered tribes of the region could unite. The people who gathered around the Immortal Bastion had been forged by generations of conflict and hardship into something unlike any other culture in Runeterra. They valued strength above all other virtues, but their concept of strength encompassed not only physical prowess, but also cunning, determination, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. These traits had allowed them to survive the collapse of Mordekaiser's empire and to thrive in the harsh conditions that characterized their homeland. The formation of the Noxian Empire represented the culmination of centuries of gradual unification among the tribes and city-states of the region. Unlike many other nations, which had been founded through conquest or divine mandate, Noxus emerged through a process of voluntary association among groups that recognized the advantages of cooperation over endless conflict. The empire's strength lay not in any single overwhelming advantage, but in its ability to integrate diverse peoples and cultures into a cohesive whole. Noxian society was built around the principle of meritocracy, the idea that advancement and authority should be based on demonstrated ability rather than inherited status or arbitrary favoritism. This philosophy created opportunities for individuals from any background to rise to positions of power and influence, provided they possessed the skills and determination necessary to succeed. The Empire's military forces, in particular, became legendary for their willingness to promote talented soldiers regardless of their origins. The expansion of Noxian territory proceeded according to a pattern that reflected the Empire's core values and strategic priorities. Rather than simply seeking to conquer and subjugate neighboring peoples, Noxian forces offered opportunities for integration and advancement to those who were willing to embrace the Empire's principles. Communities that accepted Noxian rule often found themselves with access to resources, technologies, and opportunities that had been unavailable to them as independent entities. However, Noxian expansion was not always peaceful or voluntary. The Empire's leaders understood that some conflicts were inevitable, and they prepared their forces to prosecute wars with ruthless efficiency when diplomatic solutions proved impossible. The Noxian military machine was designed to overwhelm opposition through superior organization, equipment, and tactical flexibility, while also demonstrating the benefits of submission to those who witnessed their campaigns. The Empire's approach to governance in conquered territories reflected a sophisticated understanding of the challenges involved in managing diverse populations across vast distances. Local customs and traditions were generally respected and preserved, provided they did not conflict with fundamental Noxian principles or threaten the stability of imperial rule. This pragmatic approach to cultural diversity allowed the Empire to expand rapidly while minimizing the risk of rebellions or resistance movements. As Noxian influence spread across central Valoran, the Empire inevitably came into contact with other emerging powers that had their own ambitions and spheres of influence. The most significant of these potential rivals was the kingdom that was developing in the western reaches of the continent, around the ancient mountain known as Targon. This realm, which would eventually take the name Demacia, represented a very different approach to the challenges of governance and national development. The founding principles of Demacia had been shaped by the traumatic memories of the Rune Wars and the other magical catastrophes that had devastated so much of Runeterra in previous centuries. The kingdom's early leaders had witnessed firsthand the destructive potential of uncontrolled magical forces, and they were determined to create a society that could protect itself from such threats while still allowing for prosperity and growth. The discovery of petricite, a mineral that could absorb and neutralize magical energies, provided the foundation for Demacia's unique approach to the challenges posed by magic in the modern world. This remarkable substance could be incorporated into building materials, weapons, and armor to create environments that were largely immune to magical attack or interference. For a people traumatized by centuries of magical warfare, petricite represented the possibility of true security and stability. Demacian society developed around the twin principles of order and protection, with elaborate legal codes and social hierarchies designed to ensure that every citizen knew their role and responsibilities within the larger community. The kingdom's military forces were organized around these same principles, emphasizing discipline, training, and the use of petricite equipment to neutralize magical threats. The Demacian approach to warfare prioritized defensive strategies and the protection of civilian populations over aggressive expansion or conquest. The relationship between magic and society in Demacia was complex and often contradictory, reflecting the genuine tensions between the kingdom's desire for security and the practical realities of governing in a world where magical forces were ubiquitous. While the official policy toward magic was one of suspicion and control, the kingdom's leaders recognized that some magical practices were too useful to abandon entirely. The result was a system that attempted to distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable forms of magical activity. Though the criteria for making such distinctions were often unclear or arbitrary, the emergence of the Mage Seekers as an official organization within Demacian society marked a significant escalation in the kingdom's efforts to control magical activity within its borders. These specialized investigators and enforcers were tasked with identifying individuals who possessed magical abilities and ensuring that such abilities were either properly regulated or eliminated entirely. The Mage Seekers' methods were often harsh and unforgiving, reflecting the genuine fear that many Demacians felt toward any form of uncontrolled magical power. The philosophical differences between Demacia and Noxus created the foundation for what would become one of the most enduring rivalries in Runeterra's political landscape. Where Demacia emphasized stability, tradition, and the preservation of established order, Noxus celebrated change, ambition, and the constant striving for improvement. Where Demacia sought to protect its citizens from external threats through defensive strategies and magical nullification, Noxus believed that the best defense was an aggressive offense that could eliminate threats before they became serious problems. These fundamental disagreements about the proper role of government, the relationship between individual ambition and social stability, and the appropriate response to magical phenomena would shape the interactions between the two powers for centuries to come. The border regions between Demacian and Noxian territory became theaters for proxy conflicts and diplomatic maneuvering, as each side sought to advance its influence while avoiding the catastrophic general war that would inevitably result from direct confrontation between their main forces. The development of these new political entities marked a fundamental shift in the balance of power across Runeterra. The age of god warriors and ancient empires was ending, replaced by an era in which mortal institutions and human ingenuity would play increasingly important roles in determining the fate of nations and peoples. The lessons learned from previous catastrophes would influence the policies and priorities of these emerging powers, but they would also discover new challenges and opportunities that their predecessors could never have imagined. In the centuries following the catastrophic transformation of the Blessed Isles into the cursed realm known as the Shadow Isles, the survivors of that ancient paradise had become something altogether different from what they had once been. The corruption that had spread outward from the Well of Ages had not simply killed the island's inhabitants, but had fundamentally altered their very nature, binding them to the realm between life and death in ways that defied conventional understanding. Among the most tragic of these transformations was that of Thresh, who had once served as the Warden of Thresholds with dedication and honor. His original role had involved maintaining the magical barriers that protected the Blessed Isles from unwanted intrusion, a responsibility that required both great knowledge and unwavering commitment to the welfare of his people. The corruption of the Ruination had taken these noble qualities and twisted them into something monstrous and perverse. The Thresh, who emerged from the catastrophe, bore little resemblance to the scholarly guardian he had once been. The magical energies that had transformed him had stretched his consciousness across dimensions, allowing him to perceive and interact with realms that mortal minds were never meant to comprehend. This expanded awareness had driven him to madness, but it had also granted him powers that exceeded anything he had possessed in life. As the Chain Warden, Thresh developed an obsession with collecting souls, viewing each consciousness he captured as a precious addition to his ever-growing hoard of spiritual treasures. His methods were both sophisticated and cruel, involving elaborate psychological torments designed to break his victim's will and prepare them for eternal servitude. The lantern that became his most recognizable artifact served not merely as a weapon, but as a prison capable of containing multiple souls while keeping them conscious of their fate. The transformation of Thresh represented more than just personal tragedy. It symbolized the complete inversion of everything the Blessed Isles had once represented. Where the islands had been dedicated to healing and protection, the Shadow Isles became a source of suffering and corruption. Where the original inhabitants had worked to preserve life and knowledge, their undead successors sought only to extend their curse to the living world beyond their borders. Another prominent figure among the Shadow Isles' cursed inhabitants was Hecarim, whose fall from grace was no less complete than Thresh's, but took a very different form in life. Hecarim had been the commander of the Iron Order, King Viego's elite cavalry unit, renowned for their discipline, courage, and unwavering loyalty to the crown. The Ruination had transformed him into a spectral centaur, whose very existence was defined by an eternal hunger for the thrill of battle and the destruction of the living. Hecarim's undead form combined the worst aspects of his mortal personality with supernatural power and complete absence of moral restraint. The pride and ambition that had driven him to excel as a military commander became twisted into an insatiable need for domination and destruction. His loyalty to Viego, once a virtue, became a slavish devotion to a mad king whose obsessions had doomed them all. The spectral cavalry that Hecarim commanded in Undeath was a mockery of the disciplined force he had once led. These ghostly riders were bound to him not by respect or shared purpose, but by the same curse that had transformed them all. They rode across the Shadow Isles in endless pursuit of enemies that could never be truly defeated, their passage leaving trails of corruption that poisoned everything they touched. As the Shadow Isles settled into their new existence as a realm of undeath, they began to exert influence on the wider world through a phenomenon known as the Black Mist. This supernatural fog would periodically surge outward from the islands, carrying with it the curse of undeath and the malevolent will of the Shadow Isles rulers. These events, which came to be called harrowings, represented some of the most terrifying experiences that the living world could face. During a harrowing, the normal boundaries between life and death became permeable, allowing the dead to rise and the living to be drained of their life force. Communities that found themselves in the path of the Black Mist faced a choice between fleeing their homes or fighting against enemies that could not be killed by conventional means. Even those who survived such encounters often found themselves forever changed by their exposure to the curse. The port city of Bilgewater, with its strategic location in the Serpent Isles, found itself particularly vulnerable to these supernatural attacks. The city's inhabitants, hardened by generations of conflict and survival in a lawless environment, proved more resilient than most when faced with the threat of undeath. However, even their legendary toughness was tested by encounters with forces that operated according to rules completely different from those that governed normal warfare. It was during one such harrowing that the ongoing conflict between the Shadow Isles and the forces of light took on a more personal dimension. Lucian, a member of the ancient order known as the Sentinels of Light, had dedicated his life to combating the spread of undeath and protecting the innocent from supernatural threats. His training and equipment were specifically designed to fight against creatures like those that emerged from the Shadow Isles, making him one of the few mortals capable of standing against them on equal terms. Lucian's personal investment in the war against the Shadow Isles intensified dramatically when his wife, Senna, became a target of Thresh's particular attention. The Chain Warden had developed a fascination with collecting the souls of those who fought against him, viewing their resistance as an additional challenge that made their eventual capture more satisfying. Senna's abilities as a sentinel and her unwavering commitment to the cause made her exactly the kind of prize that Thresh most desired. The confrontation between Lucian and Thresh that resulted in Senna's capture was brief but devastating in its consequences. Despite his skill and determination, Lucian found himself outmatched by an enemy who could manipulate the very foundations of reality. Thresh's victory was not merely tactical, but deeply personal, as he ensured that Lucian would be forced to live with the knowledge that his beloved was trapped within the Chain Warden's lantern, conscious and suffering, but beyond any hope of rescue. The years that followed Senna's capture were marked by Lucian's obsessive quest for revenge against Thresh and the other inhabitants of the Shadow Isles. His pursuit of the Chain Warden led him across Runeterra, following rumors and reports of supernatural activity that might indicate Thresh's presence. This single-minded focus gradually consumed every other aspect of his life, transforming him from a dedicated protector into something approaching the very monsters he fought against. Lucian's quest eventually brought him into contact with other individuals who had been affected by the Shadow Isles curse, creating unlikely alliances between people who might otherwise have been enemies. Among these was Misfortune, the notorious pirate captain whose own experiences with the Black Mist had given her both the motivation and the resources to fight against supernatural threats. Her knowledge of Bilgewater's hidden passages and secret havens proved invaluable in tracking the movements of undead creatures. Another significant ally was Olaf, the Freljordian berserker, whose fearless approach to combat made him uniquely suited to fighting enemies that relied on terror and despair to weaken their opponents. Olaf's immunity to fear, combined with his supernatural strength and endurance, allowed him to engage undead creatures in direct combat without succumbing to the psychological effects that neutralized most other warriors. The turning point in Lucian's long campaign came when he finally managed to track Thresh to a location where the Chain Warden was vulnerable to attack. The confrontation was everything that years of preparation and planning had been building toward. A final test of skill, determination, and will between two implacable enemies. The battle raged across multiple dimensions of reality, as Thresh's supernatural abilities allowed him to manipulate the battlefield in ways that challenged every assumption about the nature of combat. In the end, it was not superior force, but superior understanding that gave Lucian the advantage he needed. Through his years of studying the Shadow Isles and their inhabitants, he had learned that even the most powerful undead creatures were bound by certain limitations and vulnerabilities. Thresh's connection to his lantern, which was the source of much of his power, also represented a potential weakness that could be exploited by someone with sufficient knowledge and determination. The moment of Thresh's defeat was marked not by destruction, but by liberation, as the souls trapped within his lantern were finally freed from their eternal torment. Among these was Senna. Though her long imprisonment had changed her in ways that neither she nor Lucian had anticipated, her exposure to the energies of the Shadow Isles had given her abilities that bordered on the supernatural, while her consciousness had been expanded by her experience of existing in a realm between life and death. Senna's return to the physical world was not a simple restoration of what had been lost, but the beginning of a new chapter in the ongoing war against the Shadow Isles. Her unique understanding of the curse that bound the island's inhabitants, combined with her enhanced abilities and unshakable determination, made her a formidable opponent for the forces of undeath. The weapons and techniques she developed during her imprisonment would prove crucial in subsequent battles against the Shadow Isles. However, the defeat of Thresh did not mark the end of the Shadow Isles' threat to the living world. The islands themselves remained cursed, and other powerful undead creatures continued to rule over different regions of the transformed archipelago. Most significantly, the original source of the corruption, King Viego himself, remained largely dormant, but potentially capable of awakening to unleash even greater horrors upon the world. The period following Thresh's initial defeat was marked by increased activity among other inhabitants of the Shadow Isles, as various factions sought to fill the power vacuum created by the Chain Warden's temporary absence. This internal conflict provided opportunities for the forces of light to make inroads into the cursed realm, but it also created new threats as different undead rulers sought to prove their supremacy through increasingly destructive acts. Among the most significant developments during this period was the awakening of Gwen, a doll brought to life by fragments of Queen Isolde's soul. Unlike the other inhabitants of the Shadow Isles, Gwen retained much of the love and compassion that had characterized Isolde in life, making her a unique figure in a realm otherwise dominated by hatred and despair. Her ability to manipulate reality through her connection to Isolde's memories gave her power that rivaled that of the Shadow Isles' greatest champions. Gwen's emergence marked the beginning of a new phase in the conflict between the Shadow Isles and the forces of light. Her unique perspective and abilities offered possibilities for redemption and healing that had not existed since the original corruption of the Blessed Isles. However, her very existence also threatened to awaken Viego himself, as the Mad King's obsession with his lost queen made any manifestation of Isolde's essence a powerful draw for his attention. The complex relationships between the various supernatural entities associated with the Shadow Isles created opportunities for both conflict and cooperation that would shape the future of the ongoing war. The Sentinels of Light found themselves forced to make difficult decisions about alliances and priorities, while the inhabitants of the Shadow Isles discovered that their shared curse did not necessarily create shared interests or goals. As these various forces maneuvered for advantage, the wider world continued to feel the effects of the Shadow Isles' influence through periodic harrowings and the gradual spread of undeath to regions that had previously been safe from supernatural threats. The war between light and darkness that had begun with the ruination continued to evolve, taking new forms and creating new challenges that would test the resolve and ingenuity of all those who sought to protect the living from the curse of eternal undeath. In the centuries following the great catastrophe that had divided the ancient city of Ashravazan into two distinct communities, the twin cities of Piltover and Zon had evolved along divergent paths that reflected their fundamentally different approaches to progress, innovation, and the relationship between technology and society. What had begun as a simple geographical separation between upper and lower districts had gradually transformed into a complex social and economic hierarchy that would define both cities for generations to come. Piltover, the gleaming city of progress that rose above the waters of the new canal, had become a beacon of technological advancement and commercial prosperity that attracted the finest minds and most ambitious entrepreneurs from across Runeterra. The city's success was built upon the foundation of Hextech technology, a revolutionary fusion of magic and engineering that had unlocked possibilities that previous generations could never have imagined. At the heart of this technological revolution stood Jace Talus, a brilliant inventor whose innovations had fundamentally transformed not only his own city, but the entire understanding of what was possible when magic and science worked in harmony. Jace's journey from promising student to celebrated inventor had been marked by a series of breakthroughs that demonstrated both his exceptional intellect and his unwavering commitment to using technology for the betterment of society. His early experiments with magical crystals had revealed the potential for creating devices that could channel and control magical energies with unprecedented precision and safety. Unlike the dangerous and unpredictable magical practices that had caused so much devastation in previous eras, Hextech offered the promise of magic that could be regulated, standardized, and mass-produced for the benefit of all. The development of Hextech technology had not been without its challenges and controversies. The Piltover Academy, where much of the foundational research was conducted, was home to a diverse community of scholars and inventors whose approaches to innovation often conflicted with one another. Among the most significant of these intellectual disagreements was the ongoing debate between Jace and his former research partner Victor, whose philosophical differences about the proper application of technology would eventually lead to a permanent rupture in their relationship. Victor's vision of progress was fundamentally different from Jace's optimistic belief in technology as a tool for general improvement. Where Jace saw Hextech as a means of enhancing human capability while preserving human nature, Victor believed that true advancement required the replacement of fallible organic components with superior mechanical alternatives. His experiments with mechanical augmentation and artificial enhancement reflected a worldview that saw the human form itself as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a foundation to be built upon. The philosophical divide between these two brilliant minds represented a broader tension within Piltovan society about the proper limits and applications of technological advancement. Conservative voices within the city's government and academic institutions argued for careful regulation and gradual implementation of new technologies, while progressive factions pushed for rapid adoption and widespread distribution of Hextech innovations. These debates were not merely academic exercises, but had real consequences for policy decisions that would affect millions of lives. The success of Piltover's Hextech industry created enormous wealth and prosperity for the city's merchants, inventors, and investors, but it also generated new forms of inequality and social tension. The benefits of technological advancement were not distributed equally throughout society, and those who lacked the education, resources, or connections necessary to participate in the new economy often found themselves marginalized and excluded from the prosperity that surrounded them. Meanwhile, in the depths of Zaun, a very different kind of technological revolution was taking place. The harsh conditions that had resulted from the ancient industrial disaster had forced the city's inhabitants to develop innovative solutions to problems that their more fortunate neighbors above had never faced. Chemtech, the dangerous but powerful technology that emerged from Zaun's toxic environment, offered capabilities that conventional Hextech could not match, though always at a significant cost to those who used it. The development of Chemtech was driven not by academic research or commercial investment, but by the desperate necessity of survival in an environment that was actively hostile to human life. Zaunite inventors and alchemists learned to extract useful properties from industrial waste products, to create breathable air from toxic gases, and to enhance human capabilities through chemical augmentation. These achievements represented triumphs of ingenuity and determination, but they also carried risks that would have been unacceptable in safer environments. Among the most notorious figures in Zaun's scientific community was Dr. Mundo, whose experiments in biological enhancement and chemical modification pushed the boundaries of ethical research far beyond what any legitimate institution would have tolerated. Mundo's work was driven not by humanitarian concerns or scientific curiosity, but by a maddened obsession with the concept of improvement through suffering. His laboratory became a place of horror, where unwilling subjects were subjected to procedures that were more torture than treatment. The contrast between Dr. Mundo's horrific experiments and the legitimate medical research being conducted in Piltover's academies highlighted the broader differences between the two cities' approaches to scientific advancement. Where Piltovan researchers operated within ethical frameworks designed to protect both practitioners and subjects, Zaunite scientists often worked without oversight or constraints, leading to discoveries that were both revolutionary and deeply troubling. The emergence of shimmer as a widely available enhancement drug represented one of the most significant developments in Zaun's recent history. This purple substance, which could dramatically enhance physical and mental capabilities, while also creating powerful addiction and dangerous side effects, became central to the underground economy that sustained much of the city's population. The shimmer trade was controlled by a network of criminal organizations known as the Chem Barons, who wielded power that rivaled or exceeded that of any legitimate government. Among the most influential of these Chem Barons was Silco, whose vision for Zaun's future involved complete independence from Piltover and the establishment of a new nation built around the principles of strength, self-reliance, and the unfettered pursuit of power. Silco's philosophy reflected the harsh realities of life in the Undercity, where survival often required the willingness to make moral compromises that would have been unthinkable in more comfortable circumstances. The relationship between Silco and his adopted daughter Jinx represented one of the most complex and tragic aspects of Zaun's social dynamics. Jinx, originally known as Powder, had been orphaned during a failed uprising against Piltovan authority and subsequently raised by Silco as both daughter and protege. Her exceptional talent for creating explosive devices and her unpredictable, chaotic personality made her both an invaluable asset and a constant source of concern for her adoptive father. The transformation of Powder into Jinx was emblematic of the broader ways in which Zaun's environment could corrupt and damage even the most promising individuals. The trauma of her childhood experiences, combined with exposure to shimmer and the constant stress of life in the Undercity, had created psychological instabilities that manifested in increasingly destructive and unpredictable behavior. Her brilliant mind, which might have produced great benefits for society under different circumstances, instead became focused on creating ever more elaborate and dangerous weapons. The ongoing conflict between Jinx and her sister Vi represented a personal tragedy that reflected the larger tensions between Piltover and Zaun. Vi, who had been captured and imprisoned following the failed uprising that killed their parents, had spent years in Piltover's detention facilities before eventually joining the city's Enforcer Corps. Her decision to work within the system that had oppressed her community was motivated by a genuine desire to create positive change, but it also created an unbridgeable gulf between her and the sister she had tried to protect. The enforcement of Piltovan law within Zon was a task that required both considerable courage and a willingness to navigate complex moral ambiguities. Caitlin Kierman, one of Piltover's most dedicated and capable sheriffs, had made it her mission to combat the corruption and violence that plagued the Undercity, while also addressing the systemic inequalities that contributed to these problems. Her partnership with Vi represented an attempt to bridge the divide between the two cities through personal relationships and mutual understanding. However, the challenges facing those who sought to reform the relationship between Piltover and Zon were enormous and deeply rooted in centuries of accumulated grievance and mistrust. The economic systems that sustained both cities were built upon arrangements that benefited Piltover at Zon's expense, while the social and cultural differences between the communities had created barriers to communication and cooperation that were difficult to overcome. The development of time manipulation technology by the young inventor Echo represented one of the most promising attempts to find solutions to problems that had previously seemed intractable. Echo's ability to manipulate temporal flow on a small scale allowed him to experiment with different approaches to complex situations, effectively giving him multiple opportunities to find optimal solutions to difficult challenges. His work with the Firelight Gang demonstrated how advanced technology could be used to protect communities and resist oppression without resorting to the kind of indiscriminate violence that characterized much of Zon's underground economy. The various technological innovations emerging from both cities had begun to attract attention from external powers who recognized their potential military and economic applications. Noxian agents operating within Piltover sought to acquire Hex-Tech weapons and devices that could enhance their empire's already formidable military capabilities, while other nations worried about the implications of allowing such powerful technologies to remain concentrated in a single location. The transformation of Warwick from man to monster represented one of the most horrific examples of how Zon's chemical technologies could be misused and perverted. The experiments that had created this chimeric hunter were intended to develop new methods of biological enhancement, but they had instead produced a creature that embodied the worst aspects of both human intelligence and animal savagery. Warwick's existence served as a warning about the dangers inherent in pushing the boundaries of scientific knowledge without adequate safeguards or ethical constraints. The mechanical augmentation of Urgot, a former Noxian executioner who had been subjected to Zaunite experimentation against his will, demonstrated how the city's technologies could be used as instruments of punishment and control rather than improvement and liberation. The fusion of organic and mechanical components that characterized Urgot's new form was a grotesque parody of the enhancement technologies that were supposed to represent progress and advancement. As tensions between the twin cities continued to escalate, driven by fundamental disagreements about governance, technology, and social justice, the stage was set for conflicts that would test both communities' commitment to their stated principles and values. The question of whether technological advancement could be achieved without sacrificing human dignity and moral responsibility remained unanswered, while the growing power of both Hex-Tech and Chem-Tech promised to reshape not only local politics, but the entire balance of power across Runeterra. The ongoing evolution of both cities reflected broader themes about the relationship between progress and tradition, individual ambition and social responsibility, and the proper role of technology in human society. These questions had no easy answers, and the choices made by the inhabitants of Piltover and Zaun would have consequences that extended far beyond their own borders, influencing the development of civilization across the known world. As our journey through Runeterra's vast history draws to a close, we see how the threads of ancient choices continue to weave through modern conflicts, from the Void's eternal hunger to the Shadow Isle's undying curse, from Demasia's struggle with magic to Noxus's endless expansion. The patterns established millennia ago persist. The champions we know today carry the weight of their ancestors' decisions, fighting battles that echo conflicts from ages past. Azir rebuilds his fallen empire, while Zareth plots from his prison. The Darkened stir in their weapon prisons. The Watchers dream of their return to unmake creation itself. Yet hope endures in unexpected places, in the bonds between champions who choose light over darkness, unity over division. The League itself represents this hope, a place where conflicts might be resolved without destroying the world. As you drift into sleep, remember that every ending is also a beginning. Every defeat carries the seeds of future victory. In Runeterra, as in dreams, all stories continue, and legends never truly die. Rest well, knowing that tomorrow brings new adventures in this realm where magic and destiny intertwine.